Hello, night listener, and welcome to Little Nightmare. I'm Emma, and tonight I'll be keeping you company to help you fall asleep. But before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. Story 1. The smell arrived 3 days before Halloween. A sweet, cloying rot that clung to the back of the throat. It was not the wholesome decay of leaf piles or the smoky tang of burning wood from neighboring yards. This was different, a sugared putrescence that seeped from the very soil of the suburban development known as Harvest Point. A scent like a rotted pumpkin filled with candy corn and left to fester in the sun. Ellen noticed it first as she walked home from another fruitless job interview. The golden hour light of late October casting long, distorted shadows from the rows of grinning jack-o'-lanterns that guarded every porch. She paused, her breath catching, the scent so thick it felt like a physical presence, a veil of spoiled honey drawn across the world. Harvest Point was a neighborhood built on the forgotten bones of an old farm, its streets named for things that were no longer there. Silo Circle, Orchard Lane, Corncrib Court. It was a place of pristine lawns and identical facades. But in October, it underwent a transformation. The residents embraced Halloween with a fervor that bordered on the religious. Elaborate displays of synthetic cobwebs dripped from eaves. Plastic skeletons posed in macabre tableaus. And an entire corn maze was erected each year in the community park. Its winding paths a labyrinth of dried, rattling stalks. For Ella, who had fled a life of quiet desperation in a gray city apartment, it had initially seemed like a refuge, a place of autumnal charm and festive spirit. But as the days bled toward the 31st, the charm began to curdle. The decorations no longer seemed playful, but observant. The carved faces on the pumpkins watched her with flickering, candlelit eyes. Her own small house on Gourd Street felt less like a sanctuary and more like a fragile ship on a rising orange and black sea. The previous owner, an old woman who had died in her sleep, had left behind a collection of vintage Halloween decorations, and Ella, short on funds and spirit, had put them out. A cardboard cat with an arched back and glittering eyes sat in her window. A paper skeleton dangled from the porch rafters, its limbs clicking in the wind, and on her own front step sat a pumpkin she had carved herself. A simple, lopsided affair with triangle eyes and a stitched smile. Inside, she had placed a cheap, vanilla-scented votive. But when lit, the flame threw shadows that were all wrong, long, and grasping, that danced up the walls in shapes that did not belong to the cheerful, plump gourd. The whispers started on the 29th. Ella was in her kitchen, the sweet trot smell seeping in through the closed windows, when she heard the children outside. Their laughter was sharp, a sound like breaking glass, and it was punctuated by the rhythmic chant of a rhyme she did not recognize. The ship of orange, the ship of black, sails on a sea with no turning back. The candle flickers, the veil grows thin. Let the Harvest Point voyage begin. She peered through the window. group of 5 or 6 children, their costumes elaborate and oddly formal, a tiny pirate with a velvet coat, a girl in a lace-trimmed gown with a porcelain mask. A skeleton in a tattered tuxedo stood in a circle on the sidewalk. They were not running, not playing, but standing perfectly still, their voices a flat, unison monotone. As she watched, they turned their heads in perfect synchrony and looked directly at her house. At her. Their eyes, even through the masks, were dark and depthless. A cold that had nothing to do with the October air seeped into her bones. That night, the wind picked up, carrying the rustle of dead leaves that skittered across the roof like scurrying claws. Ella dreamed of a vast, dark ocean, but the waves were not made of water. They were a shifting, whispering mass of dried corn husks and orange leaves. A great ship sailed upon the sea, a vessel carved from a single, colossal pumpkin, its sides glowing with the hellish light of 1,000 internal candles. On its deck, figures in fine clothes and grotesque masks milled about, their laughter echoing the children's sharp, broken sounds from the waking world. And at the helm stood a tall, thin figure, a scarecrow stuffed with straw and wearing a tattered top hat, its head a hollowed-out gourd with a cruel, curling slit for a mouth. She woke with a start, the coppery taste of fear on her tongue. The sweet rot smelled stronger than ever in her dark bedroom. 30th was a day of omens. The sun was a pale, cold coin in a steel-gray sky. Frost had etched intricate, skeletal patterns on the window panes. When Ella went to check her mailbox, she found it filled not with bills, but with a handful of black licorice and candy corn, spilling out like dead insects. Down the street, old Mr. Henderson was meticulously arranging a display of rubber bats on his front lawn. He saw her and gave a slow, deliberate wave, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. He was one of the neighborhood's founding residents, a man of quiet wealth and unspoken authority, who treated the Halloween festivities with the solemnity of a high priest. "The veil is thinning, Ella," he called out, his voice carrying unnaturally in the still air. "Best to stay inside after dark. The invitations have been sent." "Invitations?" she asked, her voice small. He gestured to the candy in her hand. "For the voyage. We all have our roles to play." He turned back to his bats, adjusting one with the precision of a curator handling a priceless artifact. Panic, a fluttering bird trapped in her chest, began to beat its wings. She retreated to her house, locking the door behind her. The vintage decorations she had hung now seemed malevolent. The cardboard cat's glittering eyes seemed to follow her. The paper skeleton's click-clack in the wind sounded like bony fingers tapping out a code. She was a passenger on a ship she had never meant to board, a vessel of luxury, and the hope of a new life that was giving way to a disaster she could not name. That evening, driven by a need for normalcy, she decided to carve another pumpkin, something to reclaim the holiday. She selected a large, handsome one from the pile at the local market, its skin a deep, vibrant orange. But when she sliced off its top and plunged her hand into the cold, wet innards, Her fingers closed around something hard and smooth. Gagging at the slick, stringy pulp, she pulled it out. It was a small porcelain doll-esque face, cracked and stained, one eye missing. Its remaining eye was a piercing, painted blue, and it stared up at her with an expression of ancient malice. With a cry, she dropped it into the bowl of glistening seeds and pulp. The sweet rot smell erupted from the pumpkin-esque open belly, so powerful it made her eyes water. She stumbled back, wiping her slimy hand on her jeans, the coppery taste of fear flooding her mouth again. The carving knife was not a tool of creation, but of violation. She had opened a door. Halloween morning dawned with an unnatural stillness. The wind had died completely. The world was holding its breath. The orange glow of the harvest moon, which had hung low and heavy for nights, had been replaced by a flat, oppressive gray light. The countdown was over. It was October 31st. By afternoon, the neighborhood was a hive of subdued activity. Parents dressed their children in costumes that seemed less like play and more like ritual vestments. The air hummed with a low, anxious energy. As dusk began to bleed into the horizon, the candles in the jack-o'-lanterns were lit, their collective glow transforming Harvest Point into a phantom fleet. 1,000 tiny ships burning on a sea of shadow. The flickering light made the plastic skeletons seem to twitch, the synthetic cobwebs to pulse with a hidden life. Ella did not answer the door for the first trick-or-treaters. She watched from her window as the tiny ghosts and goblins, superheroes and witches, approached her porch. They would stop, look at her pumpkin with its stitched smile, and then, without ringing the bell, move on to the next house. They were not here for her candy. They were waiting for something else. The group of children from the other day appeared as the last of the light faded. They were once again in their formal, anachronistic costumes. They did not carry plastic buckets, but small, woven baskets. They stopped in the middle of the street, directly under a flickering orange street lamp, and began their chant again, their voices clearer now, more resonant. The ship is sailing, the feast is laid. For the honored guests, the masquerade. The mask stays on until the end. On the captain, you can depend. Then, from the direction of the community park, came the low, mournful blast of a horn. It was a sound that did not belong. A deep, wet, guttural note that rolled through the streets like fog. The children turned as one and began to walk toward the sound, their movements unnaturally fluid and synchronized. Ella knew, with a certainty that froze the blood in her veins, that she was meant to follow. This was the voyage. This was the disaster. She was one of the wealthy passengers, hiding the secret of her own emptiness, her flight from a past that had already hollowed her out. The crew, the Mr. Hendersons of this world, were maintaining an order that served only the captain. And the spectral presence, the cursed force, was the holiday itself, the ancient, hungry thing that wore the mask of a children's festival. She pulled on a coat and stepped out into the cold. The sweet rot smell was now a physical fog, mingling with the mist from the fog machines, creating a miasma that obscured vision and choked the lungs. She followed the children, her footsteps silent on the carpet of damp leaves. Other adults were emerging from their homes, their faces blank, their movements somnambulant. They too were dressed in costumes, but these were not the store-bought kind. They were elegant, antique, and unsettlingly familiar. A woman in a beaded flapper dress with a face of cracked porcelain. A man in a Victorian gentleman's suit, his head replaced by a polished, featureless orb. They were the wealthy passengers on this cursed voyage, their true identities hidden, their secrets festering beneath the finery. They converged on the corn maze. The entrance, usually a cheerful archway, was now a gaping maw, the dried stalks rustling with a sound like a million whispering voices. The horn sounded again, closer now, from the heart of the labyrinth. Ella stepped inside. The world changed. The rustling stalks pressed in, their shadows long and grasping in the erratic glow of strategically placed orange lights. The path, which should have been straightforward, twisted and turned back on itself. Laughter echoed, sometimes the bright sound of children, sometimes the deeper, crueler laughter of adults. She caught glimpses of the other passengers moving through parallel paths, their masked faces turning toward her before disappearing into the corn. The crew was here. 2 neighbors she recognized, now wearing the grim, determined expressions of sailors in a storm, herding the lost, guiding the chosen. At the center of the maze, she found the source of the horn. It was not a horn at all, but a massive, hollowed-out log, and Mr. Henderson stood beside it, striking it with a mallet made of a thick, gnarled branch. The center was not a clearing, but a shore. The corn ended, and before her stretched the sea from her dream, a vast, shifting plain of husks and leaves, silent and immense. And there, beached upon it, was the ship, the SS Harvest, a leviathan of vine and rind, its pumpkin hull glowing with a sickly internal light, its deck crowded with silent, watching figures in masks. A gangplank of woven cornstalks led from the shore to the deck. The passengers began to board, their steps heavy with a dreadful inevitability. Ella tried to back away, but the cornstalks behind her had woven themselves into an impenetrable wall. Mr. Henderson saw her and gestured with his mallet. His face was no longer that of a kindly old man. It was stretched, eager, his eyes reflecting the pumpkin light with a fanatical gleam. "Your passage is paid, Ella," he said, his voice the rustle of dry leaves. "You moved into the house. You lit the candle. You accepted the invitation. The captain awaits his guests." She was pushed forward by an unseen force, up the creaking gangplank. The deck was a scene of a ghastly party. A banquet table was piled high with glistening fruit that smelled of decay, with caramel apples crawling with ants, with bowls of candy that writhed as if alive. The masked figures did not speak, but their heads turned slowly, their hollow eyes fixed on her. At the far end of the deck, on a throne of twisted vines and weathered pumpkins, sat the captain. It was the scarecrow from her dream, tall and impossibly thin, Its top hat was rakishly askew, its straw-stuffed limbs twitching with a faint, rustling sound. Its head was a jack-o'-lantern, but this one was alive, the carved features shifting in the pulsating candlelight within. The slit of a mouth curled into a wider, hungrier smile. It raised a gloved hand, a glove stuffed with straw, and beckoned. This was the revelation. The horror was not a ghost or a monster. It was the ritual itself, the collective, willing surrender to the pageantry of fear, the offering of their own identities, their secrets, their quiet despairs, to the ancient liminality of this one night. Harvest Point was not a neighborhood, it was a feeding ground. And Halloween was the harvest. The party began to dissolve into chaos. A woman in a beautiful mask screamed as the mask fused to her skin, the porcelain becoming flesh, the painted smile now her permanent, agonized expression. A man who had worn a wolf-s head found his hands curling into paws, his back arching, a real growl tearing from his throat. The luxury of their hidden lives was giving way to the disaster of their true, revealed natures. The crew, the loyalists like Mr. Henderson, moved among them, not to help, but to corral them, to ensure the ceremony reached its climax. Ella stumbled backward toward the ship's railing. The sea of husks whispered to her, promising not safety, but oblivion. The captain stood from its throne and began to walk toward her, its movements a jerky, stop-motion horror, the light from its head flaring. "You have no mask," it rasped, its voice the sound of 1,000 dried leaves scuttling across pavement. All passengers must wear a mask for the voyage. It reached for her face with its straw-filled glove. She felt an unbearable pressure, a crushing weight on her features, as if her very bones were being reshaped. She screamed, but the sound was muffled, absorbed by the thickening air. She could feel her skin hardening, her vision narrowing into 2 fixed points of orange light. She was becoming her own jack-o'-lantern, a living, screaming decoration for this eternal, hellish Halloween. She woke up. She was in her own bed. Gray morning light filtered through the windows. It was November 1st. The sweet rot smell was gone. She sat up, her body aching, her heart pounding. It was a dream, a terrible, vivid, hypnotic dream. She rushed to the window and looked out. The world was normal. The decorations were still there, but they looked cheap and silly in the cold light of day. A few overturned trash cans, scattered candy wrappers, the aftermath of a normal Halloween. Relief, warm and dizzying, flooded through her. She laughed, a shaky, broken sound. She went to the bathroom to splash water on her face, to wash away the lingering terror. She looked up into the mirror, and she did not see her own reflection. Staring back at her was a face of smooth, waxy orange flesh. 2 triangular eyes, dark and hollow. A stitched smile, carved permanently, unchangeably, into the surface. The face in the mirror was her face. The mask was not something she wore. It was what she had become. A passenger who had survived the voyage, but at a cost that rendered survival a form of damnation. She was a part of Harvest Point now, a permanent resident in its year-round autumn, a crew member for the next voyage, a flickering light in the endless fleet. She tried to scream, but the stitched smile did not move. No sound came out, only a faint, waxy smell of vanilla and extinction. And from the street below, carried on a sudden, cold gust of wind, came the sound of children's voices, faint but clear, beginning the chant for another year, on another street, in another town, waiting for the veil to thin once more. The story never truly ends, but will continue forever, unseen. The silence in the bathroom was absolute, broken only by the frantic thumping of her heart, a trapped animal beating against the unyielding cage of her new form. She raised a hand, her own familiar human hand, and touched her cheek. She felt the soft, warm skin of her face, but the mirror showed her fingers pressing against the cold, hard rind of a pumpkin. The disconnect was a physical nausea, a vertigo of the soul. She stumbled back into the hallway, her breath coming in ragged, soundless gasps. The house was different. The morning light, which should have been a comfort, was a dull, jaundiced yellow, casting long, distorted shadows that clung to the corners like cobwebs. The vanilla-scented votive from her jack-o'-lantern sat on the hallway table, its candle long since extinguished. But the cloying, waxy smell of it now seemed to emanate from her own pores. A knock at the front door made her jump. It was a normal, solid sound, but it sent a tremor of pure dread through her. She moved to the door, her legs feeling like wood, and looked through the peephole. Mr. Henderson stood on her porch, holding a wicker basket filled with glossy red apples. He was wearing a simple, neat cardigan and slacks, the picture of a kindly grandfather. But his eyes, when they met the distorted lens of the peephole, held a flat, knowing light. "Ella," he called, his voice muffled but clear. "Welcome to the crew. I've brought you a housewarming gift, the best of the harvest." She couldn't speak. She couldn't open the door. She stood frozen, her hand on the knob. "You'll learn," he continued, his tone conversational, as if discussing the weather. "The first year is always the hardest. The memory of your old face, the struggle of the new one. But it fades. The mask becomes a comfort. It's so much simpler, isn't it? No more pretending. Your truth is right there for all to see." He set the basket down on the porch step. "We have a meeting tonight at the community center to discuss preparations for next year. Your input will be valuable. You have a fresh perspective." He turned and walked away, his footsteps crunching on the fallen leaves with a finality that echoed in the hollow of her chest. Ella looked down at her hands, turning them over. They were still her hands. She could feel the texture of her jeans, the coolness of the doorknob. But when she caught her reflection in the dark glass of the oven door, the orange, carved face stared back, its stitched smile a mockery of joy. The day passed in a blur of silent horror. She was a ghost in her own home. She tried to eat, but the food tasted of dust and candle smoke. She tried to read, but the words swam on the page, rearranging themselves into the children's rhyme. The ship of orange, the ship of black. As dusk began to fall, the compulsion to go to the community center meeting grew inside her, a deep, resonant pull, like a tide she could not fight. It was not a choice. It was her function. She put on her coat and walked out the door, her feet carrying her with a certainty her mind did not possess. The others were already there. The woman who had been the porcelain flapper sat knitting, her face a permanent, serene mask of cracked white glaze. The man with the featureless orb head nodded a greeting as she entered. They were all there, the passengers from the ship, now the permanent residents of Harvest Point. They were arranging pamphlets, polishing silver bells, discussing the optimal placement of fog machines for the next Halloween. They spoke in normal, cheerful voices about budgets and neighborhood watch schedules. But their reflections in the polished tabletop showed the monstrous revelry of the night before. Mr. Henderson presided. He handed her a stack of orange paper. "You can be in charge of the invitations this year, Ella. The candy corn and licorice. It's an important job. It calls the right kind of children." She took the papers. Her fingers left no smudges. She was a part of the mechanism now, a cog in the great, grinding wheel of the ritual. She looked out the window at the quiet, normal-looking street. A family was unloading groceries from their car. A dog barked. It was all a lie, a beautiful, terrible set dressing for the real work that happened here. The harvesting of hope, the sailing of the ship, the feeding of the captain. And she knew, with a cold, waxy certainty, that her job was not just to hand out invitations. It was to find the next one, the next person running from something, hollowed out and hoping for a sanctuary, the next passenger for the SS Harvest. The cycle demanded it. The story never truly ends, but will continue forever, unseen, until it finds a new home and a new face to carve into its crew. The thought settled deep within her, not as a foreign intrusion, but as a familiar, dormant truth now awakened. She looked down at the orange papers in her hands. They were simple flyers for a Harvest Point autumn social, but the words seemed to bleed into one another, the ink smelling faintly of spice and damp earth. This was her purpose now, to weave the net that would catch the next lost soul. The meeting ended with the same mundane chatter one might hear at any town council gathering. As the others filed out, their reflections in the glass door warping and twisting, Mr. Henderson placed a hand on her arm. His touch was dry and light, like a bundle of straw. "You'll feel more yourself soon," he said, his voice a low, confidential rustle. "The longing for what you were will be replaced by the satisfaction of your duty. Watch the new family on Elm Street. The Millers. He lost his job. They're hoping a fresh start will fix things." He smiled, a benign, grandfatherly expression that never reached his cold, knowing eyes. "They are ripe." Ella walked home under a sky the color of a day-old bruise. The world was no longer just a place. It was a larder. Every house contained a potential story, a secret sadness that could be cultivated and harvested. She saw the miller's house, with its forlorn sold signs staked in the front yard, and she felt a pull, a specific, targeted hunger. It was the same pull she had felt toward this place, a pull she now understood had been Mr. Henderson's doing. Back inside her kitchen, she stood before the sink. She turned on the tap, watching the clear water swirl down the drain. She looked up, and the face in the window's black reflection was the jack-o'-lantern's face, immutable and grim. But a new sensation was blooming behind the fixed smile, a slow, cold warmth. It was the satisfaction Henderson had promised. The horror was not gone, but it was being assimilated, becoming a part of her new anatomy. The terror of being trapped was transforming into the grim power of being the trapper. She would design the invitations for the autumn social herself. She would use warm, welcoming colors. She would make sure the Millers felt seen, felt welcomed, felt that Harvest Point was the answer to their quiet desperation. She would be the friendly neighbor who understood. She would be the one to hand them the candy corn and the black licorice, the unspoken invitation to a voyage from which there was no return. The story never truly ends. It simply finds a new narrator. And as Ella picked up a pen, her hand moving with an unnerving steadiness, she began to write the first words of the next chapter, her permanent, stitched smile, a silent promise of the horrors to come. The pen felt foreign in her grip, a tool that was now an extension of a will that was not entirely her own. The words flowed onto the orange paper without conscious thought, a script written by the ancient hunger of the place. You are cordially invited, a fresh start, a community that cares. Each phrase was a hook, baited with the very hope the Millers would be clutching. She could almost see them, a couple in their late 30s, with tired, hopeful eyes, imagining barbecues and block parties, completely unaware of the feast for which they were to be the main course. A week later, she saw them unloading a moving van. She watched from her window, a spectator behind a waxy, orange mask they could not see. She timed her approach perfectly, waiting until the man, David Miller, was struggling alone with a heavy bookshelf. Need a hand? Her voice came out normally, a pleasant, neighborly sound. It was a relief and a terror, this ability to sound human. David looked up, sweating and grateful. Oh, wow, that would be amazing. I'm David. Ella, she said, and the name felt like a costume. She took one end of the bookshelf, her strength unnervingly steady. As they shuffled the furniture into the house, she made polite, probing conversation. It's a great neighborhood, very close-knit. You'll find everyone is very welcoming here. She saw the flicker of relief in his eyes. He was a man who needed to belong. His wife, Sarah, came out with a glass of water for Ella. Her smile was strained, the smile of someone trying to believe in a new beginning. It's so nice to meet a friendly face already, she said. This whole move has been a lot. It gets easier, Ella said, and the lie was as smooth as polished stone. In fact, we're having a little neighborhood social this weekend. An autumn social. You should come. It's the perfect way to meet everyone." She handed Sarah the orange invitation. Sarah's fingers brushed against the paper, and a tiny, almost imperceptible shiver went through her. "Oh, how lovely. We'd be delighted." Ella smiled her human smile, but inside, the jack-o'-lantern's grin widened in triumph. The hook was set. The rest of the week was a countdown. She watched the Miller house with a predatory patience. She saw David leave for job interviews that she knew would lead nowhere. She saw Sarah tending the garden with a desperate sort of care, as if she could force roots to grow in barren soil. They were perfect. They were ripe. The night of the social, the community center was warm and bright, filled with the smell of spiced cider and the sound of friendly chatter. To any outsider, it was the picture of idyllic suburban life. But Ella saw the truth beneath the surface. The porcelain woman's laugh was a little too brittle. The man with the orb head nodded with a slow, deliberate rhythm. Mr. Henderson moved through the crowd like a shepherd, his eyes cataloging the Millers' every nervous gesture, their every hopeful smile. Ella played her part. She brought Sarah a cup of cider. "It's a special recipe," she said, "a local tradition." Sarah drank it, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "It's delicious. It tastes like nostalgia." "That's the idea," Ella said softly. Later, as the party wound down, Mr. Henderson clinked a spoon against his glass. "A small tradition," he announced, his voice avuncular and warm. "For our new neighbors, a welcome gift." He produced 2 small drawstring bags. One was filled with candy corn, the other with black licorice. He pressed them into the Miller's hands. David and Sarah laughed, touched by the gesture. "How thoughtful," Sarah said, clutching the bags like talismans. Ella watched them walk back to their new home, their steps light, their faces full of a belief in the future that was about to be systematically dismantled. She stood on the steps of the community center, the cool night air feeling like her true element. Mr. Henderson came to stand beside her. "Well done," he rustled. "The candle is lit. The invitation is accepted. The veil will do the rest." Ella didn't answer. She simply watched the Miller house, a dark silhouette against the deepening twilight. She could already feel the change in the air, the subtle thickening, the first faint whisper of the sweet rot smell. The SS Harvest was preparing for another voyage, and she was no longer a passenger. She was part of the crew that would ensure it sailed on schedule, forever and ever, into the endless, hungry dark. The next morning, Ella stood at her kitchen window, waiting. The gray dawn light revealed David Miller standing on his own porch, staring out at the street with a vacant expression. He held a mug of coffee, but he wasn't drinking. He was just standing there, as if listening to a distant, unsettling sound. Ella knew that look. It was the first crack, the first sign that the familiar was beginning to curdle. He was sensing the wrongness in the angles of the houses, the peculiar stillness of the air, the way the autumn colors seemed a little too vibrant, a little too bloody. A few days later, Sarah Miller appeared at Ella's door. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her hands fluttering nervously. "Ella, hi, I'm sorry to bother you. It's probably nothing." She forced a laugh that was too high, too tight. "Have you ever noticed a smell like old pumpkins and vanilla candles? It's in our house. I can't find the source. David says he can't smell it at all." Ella offered a sympathetic smile, the expression feeling like a practiced muscle memory. "Old houses have their quirks," she said, her voice a soothing balm. "You get used to it. It's just part of Harvest Point." She saw the desperate need for reassurance in Sarah's eyes, the willingness to accept any explanation, no matter how thin. She was being conditioned, prepared for the larger strangeness to come, the compulsion to guide them, to usher them toward the threshold, was a physical force in Ella's chest. She found herself leaving a small, carved pumpkin on their doorstep. She started a rumor at the local grocery store, whispered to a busybody who was also, Ella now knew, a member of the crew, that the Miller family was so perfect for the neighborhood. They seem like they've always been here. The words were a spell, weaving the Millers tighter into the town's sinister tapestry. On the afternoon of October 31st, Ella saw David in his backyard, staring at a tree whose branches seemed to claw at the sky. His shoulders were slumped in a posture of profound defeat. He had just received another rejection letter. Ella was sure of it. The perfect storm of despair was gathering. The veil was thinning, and their hidden sorrows were becoming beacons. That evening, as the sun set, turning the world a deep, unsettling orange, Ella took her place on her own porch. She held a large wooden bowl filled with the candy corn and licorice. The first children, the normal, laughing children from a few streets over, came and went, their sacks filling with harmless chocolate and fruit chews. She waited. Then she saw them. David and Sarah, holding hands, walking down the sidewalk not as participants, but as observers, trying to absorb some of the night's simple joy. Their faces were pale, drawn. They had been fighting. The hopeful facade of their new life had finally crumbled. As they neared her walkway, Ella stood. She held out the bowl. "For you," she said, her voice low and resonant, carrying over the rustle of the wind in the dead leaves. "A special treat for new neighbors." David looked at the offering, his eyes glazed. Sarah hesitated, then reached out. Her fingers dipped into the candy corn, then the licorice, taking a piece of each. David, moving as if in a trance, did the same. Their hands touched the candy, and a jolt, invisible but palpable, passed through them both. Their eyes widened slightly, not with fear, but with a sudden, eerie clarity. They looked at Ella, and for a single, heart-stopping moment, she saw them truly see her not the woman, but the waxy, orange mask beneath the skin, the hollow eyes, the stitched smile. Then the moment broke. They murmured their thanks, their voices distant, and continued down the sidewalk, the candy held loosely in their hands. They didn't eat it. They didn't need to. The invitation had been accepted. The contract was sealed. Ella watched them until they turned the corner, disappearing into the gloom. The scent of vanilla and extinction was strong on the air now, and from the direction of the old ravine, she could hear the faint, impossible sound of lapping water and a deep, mournful horn. The SS Harvest was waiting. Her work was done. She went inside, closed the door, and waited for the screaming to begin. It did not begin with screaming. It began with a profound and unnatural silence that fell over Harvest Point. A blanket of quiet so heavy it seemed to absorb the very sound of the wind. Ella stood in her dark living room, her forehead pressed against the cool glass of the window, watching the Miller house. The porch light flickered once, twice, and then went out for good. The street was empty of trick-or-treaters now. The normal children had been called home, their parents subtly guided by an unspoken consensus that the night belonged to something else now. The only movement was the slow, drifting fall of leaves, but even they seemed to fall in a hushed, respectful descent. Then the Millers' front door opened. David and Sarah stepped out. They moved in unison, their steps synchronized and deliberate. They were not running. They were not confused. They walked with the grim purpose of people finally answering a long-avoided call. They did not look back at the house they had tried to make a home. They turned and walked down the street, toward the old ravine at the end of the cul-de-sac, the place where the trees grew thick and no streetlights shone. Ella's breath fogged the glass. This was the part she had not seen the year before, the part that happened after the invitation was accepted. The compulsion to follow was a physical tug, a string tied to her sternum. She opened her own door and stepped out into the frigid air. She was not alone. From other houses, other figures emerged. Mr. Henderson, his face a placid moon in the darkness. The porcelain woman, her glazed smile catching no light. The orb-headed man. The crew was gathering to witness the harvest. They formed a silent procession, trailing the Millers at a respectful distance. The only sound was the crunch of leaves underfoot, a rhythm like a slow, funereal drumbeat. The sweet rot smell was overpowering here, a physical presence in the air, thick as fog. At the edge of the ravine, the world changed. The familiar trees twisted into gnarled, grasping shapes. The ground underfoot became soft and spongy, like the flesh of a giant fruit. And there, where the ravine should have been, was the ship. The SS Harvest. It was not a ship of wood and metal, but a living, breathing entity of vine and gourd and hardened, weeping sap. Its hull was a mosaic of 1,000 carved jack-o'-lanterns, their inner lights glowing with a feeble, captive warmth. A gangplank of woven corn husks led down to the soft earth. David and Sarah walked up the gangplank without a moment of hesitation. As they reached the deck, figures emerged from the shadows of the ship, the crew, their faces a gallery of Halloween horrors made real. They surrounded the Millers, not with menace, but with a terrible, welcoming ceremony. Ella watched, her waxy face incapable of showing the turmoil within. She saw David turn one last time to look at the world he was leaving. His face was not one of terror, but of a deep, sorrowful understanding. Then the crew closed in. There was no violence, only a slow, deliberate transformation. David S. form seemed to soften and stretch. His skin took on the texture and color of a brown burlap sack. His face elongated, his features smoothing into the stitched, sad smile of a scarecrow. Sarah, beside him, was changing too. Her body became rigid, her skin hardening and cracking into a fine, white ceramic. Her face fixed into the wide, vacant stare and rosy-cheeked smile of a porcelain doll. The ceremony was complete. The new crew members stood motionless among the others, their humanity completely subsumed. They were cargo no longer. They were part of the vessel. Mr. Henderson let out a soft, satisfied sigh. The ship of orange and black began to move, not on water, but sliding back into the deeper darkness of the ravine, its pumpkin lights winking out one by one, until only the empty, silent woods remained. The witnesses turned and walked back to their homes. No words were exchanged. Their work was done for another year. Back inside her house, Ella went to the sink. She turned on the tap and splashed cold water on her face, a futile gesture. She looked up. The jack-o'-lantern face in the mirror was her own. The horror was now a part of her, a settled fact. The Millers were gone, and their absence was a hole in the world that only she and the others could see. But that hole was already beginning to fill with a new, quiet purpose. The cycle was complete. The story was safe. And somewhere out there, another lost soul was already packing their bags, dreaming of a fresh start. Their hope a tiny, flickering candle in the vast and waiting dark. The days that followed were flat and gray. The color drained from the world. Ella went through the motions of her life, but her attention was turned inward, listening to the new silence that had taken root in her. It was not a peaceful silence. It was the hum of a machine at rest, waiting for its next command. The hunger was dormant, but she knew it was there, a coiled thing in the pit of her being. A realtor came and stuck a new sign in the miller's yard. For sale. It was a different company, one with a bright, cheerful logo. It looked absurd and out of place. Ella watched from her window as a young couple toured the house a week later. They were laughing, pointing at the fireplace, imagining their future. Ella felt nothing. No pull, no hunger. They were not the right kind of empty. Mr. Henderson confirmed it a few days later, finding her as she pretended to weed her garden. Not them, he said simply, his voice like dry leaves skittering across pavement. Their sadness is too loud, too sharp. It lacks the proper richness. The soil is not ready. He said it with the detached expertise of a master gardener. Ella simply nodded. She understood now. It was about the quality of the despair, not the quantity. The seasons turned. Winter buried Harvest Point in a silent, white shroud. Spring arrived with a riot of color that felt like a lie. Ella found herself studying people at the grocery store, at the post office. She could see it now, the subtle signs. The man whose eyes always looked a little too wet, as if he was perpetually on the verge of tears he would never shed. The woman who smiled too brightly, her cheer a fragile shell over a deep well of loneliness. She was learning to identify the raw material. Summer baked the streets. The for sale sign came down. A family moved into the Miller house. They were loud, chaotic, full of life. Their children's toys littered the lawn. Ella felt a faint irritation toward them, but no hunger. They were immune. Their noise was a shield. It was in the late summer, during a humid evening walk, that she felt the first twinge. A moving van was parked outside a small, neglected Cape Cod on a neighboring street. A woman was directing the movers, her voice thin with a strained cheerfulness. A young boy, maybe 8 or 9, sat on the front steps, his chin in his hands, his entire small body radiating a dejection that was far too heavy for his years. He wasn't crying. He was just still, a portrait of quiet misery. Ella stopped walking. The pull was faint, a single plucked string vibrating in her chest. It wasn't directed at the woman, but at the boy. The sorrow was his. It was a deep, private well, fresh and untapped. She continued her walk, her heart beating a slow, steady rhythm of anticipation. The hunger was awake. It was subtle, it was specific, but it was there. The story was not over. It was simply waiting for the next chapter to begin. And she, Ella, with her permanent, stitched smile, knew exactly how to write it. She would find a way to the boy. A lost ball over the fence. A plate of cookies. A kind word. She would be the friendly face he could trust. The hook was being sharpened. The SS Harvest was not gone. It was only waiting. And now, so was she. The heat of the summer began to curdle into the crispness of early fall. And Ella watched the Cape Cod with a focus that made everything else blur. The woman, whose name she learned was Claire, was a recent divorcee, trying to start over. The boy was named Leo. He spent most of his days in the backyard, kicking a soccer ball against the fence, with a listless, repetitive thud that seemed to echo the beat of Ella S.'s own hidden heart. She chose a Saturday morning to make her approach. She baked a batch of snickerdoodles, the scent of cinnamon and sugar a weapon of normalcy. She arranged them on a simple ceramic plate and walked next door. Claire answered the door, her smile a tired, grateful flicker. "Oh, you shouldn't he have," she said, accepting the plate. "I am Claire, and this is Leo." She gestured behind her. The boy stood in the hallway as shadows, looking at Ella with large, wary eyes. "He didn't he speak? It has no trouble at all," Ella said, her voice a soft, warm blanket. "We look out for each other here. It has a special place." She let her gaze rest on Leo for a moment too long, pouring a tiny, almost invisible trickle of her attention onto his loneliness. She saw him shiver, though the morning was warm. The connection was made. A tiny, fragile root had been placed in his fertile sorrow. Over the next few weeks, she became a fixture. She would wave to Leo from her garden. She accidentally let her cat out when he was outside, giving them a shared purpose in coaxing the indifferent creature home. She never asked him probing questions. She simply offered a silent, understanding presence. She was a quiet harbor, and he was a ship slowly drifting toward her. One afternoon, she found him sitting on the curb, staring at a storm drain. His shoulders were slumped in that now familiar way. "Rough day?" Ella asked, sitting down beside him without waiting for an invitation. He shrugged. School's stupid. It can feel that way, she agreed. Sometimes it feels like you don't belong anywhere. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the drain, too. But you'll find your place. There's a spot for everyone in Harvest Point. You just have to be patient. She reached into her cardigan pocket and pulled out a single piece of black licorice. She didn't offer it to him. She just held it in her palm, a dark, twisted shape against her skin. Here, she said, it's an acquired taste. But once you acquire it, nothing else satisfies you quite the same. Leo looked at the licorice, then at her. His eyes were no longer just wary, they were curious. He slowly reached out and took it. His fingers did not brush against her skin. He put it in his pocket, not his mouth. He didn't thank her. He just stood up and walked back to his house, the candy a secret weight in his jeans. Ella remained on the curb, the ghost of a true smile touching her lips for the first time in almost a year. The hook was not just set, it was buried deep. The boy's quiet despair was a perfect, hollowed-out vessel, ready to be filled with the town's ancient, whispering darkness. The countdown had begun again. The leaves began to turn, not with the gentle gradient of a normal autumn, but with the sudden, violent shift of a stagehand pulling a lever. One day they were green, the next they were a searing, impossible crimson and gold. The air grew heavy with the scent of wood smoke and that underlying sweetness of decay. Ella watched it all from her window, a conductor watching her orchestra tune up. Leo's listlessness deepened as the days shortened. He stopped kicking the soccer ball. He would simply stand at the back fence, staring into the woods that separated the suburbs from the old ravine. Claire, wrapped in her own anxieties, seemed oblivious to the change in her son, mistaking his profound stillness for a form of adjustment. A week before Halloween, Ella saw her chance. Claire's car wouldn't start, and she was frantic about missing a work meeting. Ella, of course, was there in an instant, offering to watch Leo until the tow truck arrived. Claire's gratitude was a frantic, fluttering thing. She barely looked at her son as she rushed off down the street. Ella led Leo into her kitchen. The house was quiet, the air still and cool. She didn't offer him juice or a snack. She simply sat at the table with him, the silence between them a living thing. "You hear it, you," she said softly. Her voice was not her own. It was the voice of the town, the voice of the soil. Leo flinched, his eyes wide. He didn't ask what she meant. He just gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. "It's a lonely sound," Ella continued, "like a bell ringing at the bottom of a well. It calls to the lonely. It calls to those who feel they don't have a home." A single tear traced a path down Leo's cheek. He didn't wipe it away. "There's another home," Ella whispered, leaning forward. "A quiet one. A place where you don't have to try anymore. A ship that sails on a sea of shadows. It's waiting for you, Leo." It can take all the hurt away. She reached into a drawer and pulled out a small, perfectly carved pumpkin. It was no bigger than her palm, its face a simple, sad smile. She placed it on the table between them. This is an invitation. When the night comes, when the veil is thin, you follow the call. You won't be lonely ever again. Leo stared at the tiny jack-o'-lantern, his reflection distorted in its glossy orange skin. He reached out a single finger and touched the carved smile. Outside, a car door slammed. Claire was back, her crisis resolved. The moment shattered. Leo pulled his hand back, but his eyes remained locked on the pumpkin. Ella smoothly put it back in the drawer, her face a mask of benign, grandmotherly concern once more. But the seed was planted. It had taken root in the deepest, darkest part of him. That night, as Ella prepared for bed, she looked out her window and saw Leo standing at his own window, looking out toward the ravine. He was listening, and from the depths of the woods, though no normal human could perceive it, a low, mournful horn began to sound. The horn was a vibration more than a sound, a frequency that resonated in the hollow spaces of the soul. Ella watched Leo's small figure at the window, saw his head tilt as he listened to a call only he could hear. He did not look afraid. He looked like a child who had been lost in a crowd and had just heard his mother's voice. A terrible, profound relief smoothed the tension from his shoulders. The final days were a slow, excruciating unwinding. Claire, buoyed by a successful week at work, tried to inject a sense of normal Halloween excitement into the house. She bought a plastic cauldron full of candy and a cheap superhero costume for Leo. He accepted it all with a quiet, distant politeness that she mistook for maturity. He laid the costume out on his bed, but never tried it on. The bright, garish colors were a lie, and he was now privy to a deeper, truer darkness. On Halloween night, the air in Harvest Point was electric with two different kinds of energy. The shrieks of ordinary children running door to door were a bright, frantic surface noise. Underneath it, a slow, deep current pulled at the chosen. Ella took her place on her porch, her bowl of candy, a prop in a play she had performed for decades. She handed out chocolate bars and lollipops to the laughing, oblivious children, her painted smile never wavering. But her eyes were on the house next door. Claire turned on their porch light and set the candy cauldron on a small table. She waved at Ella, her face flushed with the chill and the effort of holiday cheer. Leo stood just inside the screen door, a still, dark shape. He was not wearing the costume. As the night wore on and the tide of trick-or-treaters began to ebb, the underlying silence of Harvest Point began to swell. The streetlights seemed to grow dimmer, their cones of light contracting. One by one, the normal families retreated indoors, closing their doors against a cold that felt suddenly more profound. Claire, shivering, called for Leo to come inside and help her turn off the lights. It was then that he moved. He pushed the screen door open and stepped onto the porch. He ignored his mother, his gaze fixed on the end of the street, where the pavement dissolved into the darkness of the woods. He began to walk, his steps sure and steady. Claire called his name, her voice sharp with confusion. "Leo, where are you going? It has time to come in." He didn't turn. He didn't run. He just kept walking, a small, solitary figure receding into the gloom. Ella rose from her chair. The time for watching was over. She joined the other figures emerging from the shadows of their homes: Mr. Henderson, the porcelain woman, the orb-headed man. They formed their silent procession, a funeral cortege for a boy who was not yet dead, but merely transitioning. Claire's screams began then, sharp and panicked, as she ran down her steps and saw the gathering of impossible witnesses. The sounds were swallowed by the heavy air, becoming thin and meaningless. They followed Leo to the edge of the ravine. The SS Harvest was already there, its pumpkin eyes glowing with a soft, hungry light. The gangplank of corn husks was down. Leo walked toward it without a moment of hesitation, drawn by a compulsion greater than fear, greater than love. Claire stumbled after them, her cries turning to ragged, disbelieving sobs as she saw the impossible ship. She screamed her son's name one last time. At the foot of the gangplank, Leo paused. He turned not to his mother, but to look at Ella. In his eyes, there was no accusation, only a final, quiet understanding. Then he turned and climbed aboard. The transformation was faster this time, perhaps because his sorrow was so pure, so uncomplicated by the regrets of an adult life. The living vines of the ship embraced him, not with violence, but with a dreadful tenderness. His small form softened, his skin taking on the rough, woven texture of a sack. His face elongated, his features dissolving into the simple, stitched smile and blank eyes of a small, child-sized scarecrow. He stood motionless beside the porcelain figure that had once been Sarah Miller, another permanent member of the crew. Claire's screaming stopped abruptly, not because she was silenced, but because the sight before her broke the very mechanism in her brain that allowed for such sound. She stood empty and silent as the SS Harvest slid back into the void. Ella turned and walked back to her house, the others dispersing into the night. Behind her, she could feel the new, yawning silence that was Claire, a hollowed-out vessel that would, in time, perhaps become fertile ground itself. But that was a concern for another year. For now, the story was fed. The cycle was complete, and the quiet of Harvest Point was, once again, absolute. Story 2. The knife went in. The guts came out. The knife went in. The guts came out. Curtis sat on the splintered porch steps of a house on Hemlock Street, his hands slick with the cold, stringy pulp of a pumpkin. It was the 3rd of October, and this was his ritual. Every afternoon, as the sun began its early, orange descent behind the skeletal maples, he carved one jack-o'-lantern, one for every house on the block. He did not know why he did this, only that the rhythm of it, the scoop and the scrape and the careful incision, kept the screaming silence of the world at bay. The knife went in. The guts came out. A flickering tea light would be placed inside come dusk, and for a few hours, a leering, triangular-eyed sentinel would hold its vigil against the encroaching dark. He was, as far as he knew, the last man on earth. The last one who was still Curtis anyway. The world had not ended with a bang, but with a whisper, a strange, fungal flu that swept through humanity in the autumn of the previous year. It didn't kill, not exactly. It emptied. It left behind shambling vessels, their skin pale and dry as old parchment, their eyes like dull, smoked glass. They were quiet, mostly. Stood in yards, clustered at street corners, their heads tilted as if listening to a dissonant music only they could hear. By day, they were still, statues in the rustling leaves. But at night, they grew restless. They did not moan or hunger for flesh in any classic sense. They simply pressed. They would gather outside the houses where Curtis had taken shelter, their silent, collective presence, a weight against the windows and doors, a psychic pressure that made the air itself feel thick and heavy. His only companion was a one-eared stray dog he named Buster, a creature of wiry fur and unwavering loyalty, who now lay at his feet, twitching in a dream chase. Buster was the only thing that still felt warm, truly warm, in a world gone cold. Curtis finished the last jagged tooth of the pumpkin-esque grin and set it beside the others on the porch railing. A gallery of orange grotesques, each one a feeble defiance against the stillness. He wiped his knife on his jeans, the blade catching the low sun. The air smelled of wood smoke and decay, a scent that was permanently etched into this new October. It was always October now, he sometimes believed. An endless, cooling slide toward a Halloween that never quite arrived, yet whose approach was a constant, tightening knot in his stomach. The days bled into one another, a monotony of scavenging and survival. He moved from house to house in the suburban ghost town, never staying more than a few nights. He'd eat cold beans from a can, read waterlogged paperbacks, and talk to Buster just to hear a voice, even if it was his own. He had started a calendar, scratching off the days with a piece of charcoal on a basement wall. He was counting down to the 31st. He didn't know why. It felt important, a destination. The last holiday. On the 28th, he found the first one. Not a pumpkin he had carved. It was on the porch of a Victorian house at the end of a cul-de-sac, a house he was sure he had not yet entered. The pumpkin was smaller, misshapen, its carving not the simple triangles and jagged smiles of his own, but something intricate, almost runic. The face it showed was one of pure agony, a silent scream, with tendrils carved around the eyes like roots or veins. And inside, nestled among the seeds, was not a candle, but a small, dead bird, its neck neatly broken. Curtis stared at it, a coldness seeping into his bones that had nothing to do with the autumn chill. Buster whined low in his throat, the fur on his back bristling. This was new. This was a message, or a warning. The next day, the 29th, he saw her. He was in the canned, goods aisle of the derelict Save More supermarket, a canvas bag slung over his shoulder. The silence was broken only by the scuff of his boots on the gritty tile, and then a soft rustle from the next aisle over, not the dry shuffle of the infected. This was deliberate. Light. He froze, his hand tightening on the handle of his knife. Buster stood rigid, a silent growl rumbling in his chest. Curtis peered through a gap in the shelving. A woman. She was tall, her dark hair cut short and practical. She wore a heavy canvas coat and moved with a quiet efficiency he hadn't seen in over a year. She was placing cans into her own bag, not with the frantic greed of a looter, but with the calm selection of a shopper. His heart hammered against his ribs. Another person, alive. He stepped into the aisle. Hello. She spun around, her eyes wide. A can of peaches clutched like a weapon. She was younger than he was, maybe in her late 20s, with sharp, intelligent features and eyes that held a universe of weary caution. For a long moment, they just stared at each other, two ghosts meeting in the ruins. "You ray real," Curtis finally breathed, the words feeling foreign and clumsy. "So are you," she said, her voice low and husky. For now, her name was Charity. She had been hiding, moving, surviving, just like him. She had a small, fortified base in the old elementary school on the other side of town. She was the one who had carved the pumpkin. Why, Curtis asked as they walked back through the leaf-strewn streets, the shadows lengthening around them. The bird. An offering, she said, her gaze scanning the still figures that stood in the yards they passed. The infected did not react to them. They never did during the day. They were like part of the scenery, scarecrows waiting for the moon. It's almost Samhain. The veil is thinning. They can feel it. We need to appease, or at least acknowledge. Curtis shook his head. They ray sick. They ray not ghosts. This isn't some pagan holiday story. Charity gave him a sad, knowing smile. You still think this was a disease, a random mutation of a virus. Look at them, Curtis. She gestured to a man in a faded flannel shirt standing motionless by a mailbox. They aren't decaying. They aren't rotting away. They ray just waiting. They've been harvested. The thing that took them is just letting the shells dry out in the sun. Her words unsettled him because they resonated with a fear he had never allowed himself to fully articulate. The infected didn't starve. They didn't age. They were in a state of terrible, perpetual pause. That night, at his current shelter, a cozy, 2-story colonial with yellowed lace curtains, Charity told him what she knew, or what she believed. She talked of the flu not as a pathogen, but as a spore, a seed from something old and vast that slept in the turning of the earth. It didn't consume life, it preserved it, like fruit in a jar, suspending humanity in its final moment to be tasted later. And Halloween, the true, ancient Halloween, was the time of the tasting, the night when the reaper, the harvester, whatever name you gave it, would wake and walk. It's why we feel the need to celebrate it. Even now, she whispered, the glow from the fireplace, painting her face in dancing shadows. Why you carve the pumpkins. It is a deep racial memory. We rebuilding the altar for our own sacrifice. The jack-o'-lanterns are welcome lights for the guest of honor. Curtis wanted to dismiss it as the ravings of a lonely, traumatized mind. But he couldn't. It explained the dread that thickened with every passing day. It explained the silent, patient waiting of the things outside. It explained the pumpkin with the dead bird. On the 30th, the world changed. The infected began to move during the day, not with purpose, but with a slow, drifting motion, like leaves caught in a current. They migrated toward the center of town, gathering in the square around the war memorial. Their silence was more terrifying than any noise. Curtis and Charity watched from the roof of the library, their breath pluming in the cold air. Below, hundreds of them stood, a pale, silent congregation. They were getting ready, Charity said, her voice tight. That evening, the rituals began in earnest. Charity insisted they prepare. She led him to a hardware store, and they gathered bags of salt. For the thresholds, she said. She found vintage Halloween decorations in an attic, a cardboard skeleton with a leering, hand-painted face, and a plastic witch that rattled when moved. She treated them not as toys, but as totems. We have to play our parts, she explained, her eyes fever-bright. The story is already written. We can change the ending, but maybe we can choose our roles. The fool, the witch, the hero, the victim. The masks matter tonight. Curtis felt a profound resistance to it all. It felt like madness, like giving in to the nightmare. But the alternative, that there was no reason, no rules, just a random, meaningless end, was somehow worse. Halloween morning dawned gray and cold, the sky the color of bruised flesh. The air was perfectly still, the world holding its breath. The infected were gone from the streets. They had all converged on the town square, a silent, unmoving army. Charity was gone too. She had left before first light, leaving only a note scrawled on a paper napkin. The party is at the old Miller farm, the corn maze. Don't wear a mask. Be yourself. It's the only thing it can't predict. The Miller farm. The place was legendary for its Halloween attractions, a 20-acre corn maze, a haunted hayride, a pumpkin patch. The heart of the town's festive fear. Of course, it made a terrible, perfect sense. As dusk began to bleed into the horizon, Curtis made his decision. He couldn't hide. He had to see. He filled his pockets with what he thought might be useful: his knife, a flashlight, a lighter. He looked at Buster, who thumped his tail nervously. "Stay," he commanded, his voice cracking. He closed the door on the dog's whine, a sound that felt like a piece of his soul tearing off. The walk to the Miller farm was a journey through a funhouse mirror of his old life. Every porch held a jack-o'-lantern, their candleless grins seeming to mock him. Plastic skeletons hung from trees, and in the deepening twilight, it was impossible to tell if their bones were real. The wind picked up, whispering through dead leaves, and it sounded like voices, like children chanting rhymes from a great distance. He could see the glow from the farm from a mile away. Not the warm, electric glow of festival lights, but the flickering, orange pulse of fire. Bonfires. Entrance to the corn maze was a massive archway of woven stalks, shaped like a screaming mouth. The corn on either side was bone dry, 8 feet tall, and it rustled with a sound like 1,000 rattlesnakes. Inside, the path was narrow and winding. The air was thick with the smell of dust and dry rot, and there were figures standing at the intersections, not infected, but the townspeople, or what was left of them. They were dressed in their Halloween costumes. A princess with a tiara askew on her lolling head, a superhero, his cape torn, a zombie, the makeup now horrifyingly real. They were posed, silent, part of the display. The psychic pressure was immense here, a humming vibration in the air that made his teeth ache. He could feel a presence, vast and ancient, turning its attention toward this place, this night. He followed the maze, the path seeming to shift and change behind him, the rustling stalks closing off his retreat. He heard a sound, a wet, rhythmic crunching. He turned a corner and saw a group of infected gathered around a large metal tub, the kind used for apple bobbing. But it wasn't tea apples they were bobbing for. One of them lifted its head, its mouth stained dark. A piece of something fleshy and unrecognizable clutched in its teeth. Curtis stumbled back, his stomach heaving. He finally burst into the center of the maze. It was a large, circular clearing. In the center stood a massive, withered oak tree, from which hung a tire swing that moved gently, though there was no wind. Dozens of infected stood in a perfect ring around the clearing, their faces upturned to the sky. And in the middle, standing before the tree, was Charity. She had changed. She wore a simple black dress, and her face was painted with ash. In her hands, she held the cardboard skeleton, which now seemed to writhe with a life of its own, its painted grin stretching into something obscene. "Curtis," she said, her voice echoing strangely in the clearing. "You came. You shouldn't he have. You were supposed to be the one who got away. The survivor. The proof that the story could have a different ending." "What are you talking about?" He gasped, his chest tight. "I am the narrator," she said, her eyes glowing with a reflected light that had no source. "The witch in the woods. The guide. My role is to lead the lamb to the harvest. I tried to fight it. I left you clues. The pumpkin the bird eye thought a sacrifice might satisfy it. But it wants more. It wants the one who still hopes." She gestured to the ring of infected. "They are the audience, the harvested, and he is coming." The air grew cold. The bonfires around the maze guttered, and then flared, their flames turning a sickly, phosphorescent green. The rustling of the corn ceased, and an absolute silence fell. A silence so profound Curtis could hear the blood pounding in his own ears. And then, from the shadows, at the base of the great oak, something emerged. It was not a monster in the traditional sense. It was tall, impossibly so and thin, its form composed of shifting, coalescing darkness that seemed to drink the light from the fires. It wore a shape that was almost human, but stretched and distorted like a shadow at the wrong time of day. Its face was a smooth, featureless oval, but as it turned toward Curtis, he saw it was not blank. It was a reflection. It showed him his own face, but twisted in a rictus of terror, his eyes hollow pits. This was the harvester, the spirit of this endless Halloween, the thing that had been waiting in the turning of the year. It did not move toward him. It simply was there in front of him. He felt a pulling, not on his body, but on his essence. His memories, his fears, his love for Buster, the sound of his mother's laughter, the taste of his first beer on a summer night, it was all being drawn out of him, siphoned away into that terrible, reflective face. He was being unmade. He was becoming a story in its collection, a preserved memory in its infinite, silent library. He fought, clinging to the sensation of the cold ground under his feet, the smell of the smoke, the memory of Buster's warm tongue on his hand. He was Curtis. He was real. And then he heard it, a single sharp bark. From the mouth of the maze, Buster came tearing into the clearing, a small, furious bolt of life in this temple of death. The dog launched himself, not at the harvester, but at the ring of infected, breaking their perfect circle, snarling and snapping. The presence wavered. The pulling sensation lessened for a fraction of a second. The harvester's head, with Curtis's own screaming face, turned slightly toward the disruption. It was enough. Charity screamed, a wordless cry of defiance, and threw the cardboard skeleton at the entity. The moment the cheap, painted thing touched the darkness, it burst into flames, not green, but a pure, brilliant white. The harvester recoiled, its form shimmering, the reflected face dissolving into a swirl of static. The world shattered. Curtis felt a violent lurch, like the floor of the universe had dropped out from under him. The clearing, the corn, the infected, the bonfires, it all fragmented into a kaleidoscope of orange and black and screaming faces. He was falling through a vortex of Halloween, through a million grinning pumpkins and endless rolls of synthetic cobweb, through the echoes of a billion children shouting trick or treat. He landed hard. He was on his back. The air was cold and still. He was lying in the middle of Hemlock Street. Above him, the moon, a perfect, luminous orange harvest moon, hung in a sky of velvety black. He sat up, his body aching. The world was silent. The infected were gone. The bonfires were gone. The corn maze was gone. The houses stood dark and quiet, their porches empty. All the jack-o'-lanterns he had carved were gone. The world was scrubbed clean of the holiday. All except one. On the porch of the house directly in front of him, a single pumpkin sat. It was not carved. It was whole, perfectly round, and deep blood orange in color. And from inside it, faint but unmistakable, came a sound. A slow, steady, metronomic ticking. He stared at the pumpkin. The sound drew drilling into his skull. It was the sound of a clock counting down. But to what? Next year? Another Halloween? Or was it simply the sound of his own heart, the last clock ticking in a world that had already been harvested? Didn't he know? He would never know. He sat there in the cold October dark, on the street that was once his home, and listened. The knife had gone in. The guts had come out. And now only the sound remained. Tick, tick, tick. He didn't know how long he sat there on the cold asphalt. The ticking was a parasite burrowing into his ear, into his mind. It synchronized with his heartbeat, then tried to command it. He pressed his hands over his ears, but it was no use. The sound was inside the pumpkin, but it was also inside him. A wet nose nudged his hand. Buster. The dog whined softly, his whole body trembling. Curtis wrapped his arms around the animal, burying his face in the coarse fur, seeking a warmth that he couldn't feel. The dog was real. This was real. The ticking was real. He had to move. He couldn't just sit here in the middle of the street, listening to the countdown of an unknown doom. He stood up, his legs shaky, and forced himself to walk toward the porch, toward the sound. Each step was an effort, as if the air had thickened into syrup. The pumpkin sat there, innocuous, a perfect autumn specimen. But the sound it made was the sound of a bomb. He reached for it. His hand hovered over the smooth, cool skin. He expected it to be warm, to vibrate with the energy of the ticking. It wasn't. It felt like a pumpkin. He picked it up. It was heavy, solid. The ticking grew no louder, but it felt more intimate, more personal, now that he was holding the source. He had to see. He had to know what was making the sound. He carried it into the house, Buster trailing at his heels. He set it on the kitchen table under the beam of his flashlight. The rhythmic tick, tick, tick filled the empty space, a mockery of the silence it had replaced. He drew his knife. The blade looked pitifully small, a tool for survival against a phenomenon that defied all tools. He plunged the knife into the top of the pumpkin, carving a rough circle. The sound didn't change. He pulled the plug of stem and flesh out and set it aside. The inside was dark. He shone the flashlight in. There were no seeds, no stringy pulp. The inside of the pumpkin was a hollow, smooth chamber, and in the center, suspended by nothing, hung a pocket watch. It was tarnished silver on a fine, delicate chain. Its hands were frozen at 1 minute to midnight. But the ticking came from it, a steady, relentless beat, as the second hand trembled against the 12, trying to move forward and unable to complete its journey. He reached in, his fingers brushing the cold metal. The moment he touched it, the ticking stopped. The silence was more deafening than the sound had been. It was a vacuum, sucking all the air from the room. He held the watch in his palm. It was just a watch. He shook it gently. Nothing. He pressed the crown. Nothing. Then, with a soft, silvery click, the lid of the watch sprang open. Inside, there was no face, no numbers, no hands. The watch was filled with a fine, black, granular substance, like sand or ash. As he watched, a single, tiny grain of this black sand fell from the top of the chamber to the bottom. He snapped the watch shut, a jolt of primal fear shooting through him. He didn't understand, but he knew. The harvester was gone. The immediate threat had passed, but it had left a clock. And the clock had just started. He shoved the watch into his pocket, a cold, heavy weight against his thigh. He looked at Buster. The dog was staring at the empty pumpkin shell, his head cocked. "We can't stay here," Curtis said, his voice a dry rasp. He gathered his meager supplies, his movements hurried and frantic. The house that had felt like a temporary shelter now felt like a tomb. He stepped back out into the night. The moon was still there, that impossibly orange orb. It hadn't moved an inch in the sky. He began to walk, with no destination in mind, just away. Buster walked beside him. The streets were empty. The world was empty. It was just him, his dog, and the weight of the watch in his pocket. After what felt like an hour of walking, he saw a light. A single, warm, yellow light in a downstairs window of a small bungalow. A candle. His breath caught in his throat. Another survivor. Hope, a dangerous and fragile thing, flickered in his chest. He approached cautiously, peering through the window. The room inside was clean, tidy. A fire crackled in the hearth, and in an armchair by the fire, a man sat reading a newspaper. He was normal. He was whole. He was alive. The man looked up, as if sensing he was being watched. He saw Curtis standing outside, ragged and wild-eyed. The man's face broke into a friendly, welcoming smile. He waved, and Curtis saw that on the man's wrist he wore a watch. A tarnished silver pocket watch on a chain, fastened to his belt loop. Curtis stumbled back from the window, his heart hammering. He looked down the street. In the next house over, through a parted curtain, he saw a woman setting a table. She, too, paused and glanced at the silver watch pinned to her dress. They were everywhere. The harvested. They weren't standing frozen in fields anymore. They were back. They were living their lives. They were going through the motions in a world that had ended, their clocks all ticking down in unison, counting toward a midnight he could not comprehend. He was the only one who knew. The only one who remembered the scream, the pulling, the corn maze. He was a flaw in their perfect, silent system. A single, ticking anomaly in a world of wound-up ghosts. He turned and ran, Buster at his side, fleeing from the friendly, smiling faces in the lamplit windows. He ran until his lungs burned, until he was back in the dark, empty part of town. He collapsed on a curb, pulling the watch from his pocket. He held it in his trembling hand. He didn't want to, but he had to know. He pressed the crown. The lid sprang open. The chamber of black sand was now half full. The half-full chamber was a verdict. It gave no answers, only a measurement of something he could not see. He snapped the watch shut, the click final and grim. Running was pointless. The smiling people in their homes proved that. This was not a quarantine he could escape, it was the world itself, remade. He stood, his legs aching, and began to walk again, not with panic now, but with a leaden purpose. He had to see the borders of this new reality. He walked to the edge of town, to the old state road that led out into the countryside. The moon, that perpetual orange sentinel, lit his way. The sign welcoming him to another town stood just ahead. But between him and the sign, something shimmered. It was not a wall, not a barrier he could see, but the air itself was wrong. It wavered like heat haze on a summer road, but the night was cold. He picked up a stone and threw it. The stone vanished into the shimmer and did not land on the other side. There was no other side. He walked along the perimeter of the shimmer. It was a dome, a perfect, invisible bell jar placed over his entire world. He was not in a town anymore. He was in a terrarium. Defeated, he turned back. He found an empty, unlocked gas station and took refuge inside, behind the counter. Buster curled up at his feet. He took out the watch again, his own private doom. He didn't open it. He just held its cold weight. The silence was absolute, a polished bone. Then a new sound, not ticking, a faint, rhythmic scraping. He held his breath, listening. It was coming from outside. He crept to the grimy window and peered out. Down the center of the empty street, a figure was walking. It was a man, dressed in the tattered remains of a postal worker's uniform. He was dragging a mail sack behind him, and the sound was the bag scraping against the asphalt. His head was down, his movements slow and mechanical, like a wind-up toy that was almost out of energy. He was one of the infected, or what was left of one. He wasn't smiling. He was empty. The man stopped in front of a house, the same house where Curtis had seen the man reading by the fire. He reached into his sack, pulled out a single, crisp, white envelope, and slotted it into the mailbox. Then he turned and continued his slow, scraping progress down the street. Curtis watched, a cold curiosity cutting through his despair. He waited until the postman had turned the corner. Then he slipped out of the gas station and ran to the mailbox. He opened it. The envelope was there, addressed to the homeowner, Mr. David Green. There was no postmark, no stamp. He tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of high-quality paper. The message was typed, brief and horrifying. Performance review. Satisfactory. Continue baseline activities. Your narrative contribution is appreciated. The next harvest is scheduled. Curtis dropped the letter as if it had burned him. It fluttered to the ground. This was the machinery. This was how it worked. They weren't just living their lives, they were being monitored, graded. Their existence, a form of data being collected by the thing in the watch. The harvester was not gone. It was the town. It was the sky. It was the manager of this silent, endless production. He looked back at the house. Through the window, He could see Mr. Green still in his chair, but he wasn't reading anymore. He was just sitting, staring at the wall, a placid, vacant smile on his face, waiting for his next cue. Curtis returned to the gas station, the weight in his pocket, now a different kind of burden. It wasn't just a countdown to his own end. It was a key. He was outside the system, an observer. He could see the strings. The question was, what could he do with that knowledge? He sat in the dark, Buster's head on his knee, and stared at the silver watch in his hand. He was no longer a victim waiting for the end. He was a flaw in the code, a splinter in the machine's eye. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep into his bones, that the machine would soon be sending someone to clean him up. The thought had barely formed when he saw the headlights. They were the first moving vehicle he had seen since it all ended. A black sedan, pristine and silent, glided down the street and came to a stop directly in front of the gas station. The engine cut off. The silence rushed back in, thicker than before. 2 doors opened in unison. 2 figures got out. They were dressed in dark, unremarkable suits. Their faces were pleasant, neutral, and utterly empty. They moved with a fluid, efficient grace that was more unnerving than the shambling of the infected. These were not the harvested. These were the custodians. One of them looked toward the gas station window. He didn't glare or squint. He simply looked, and Curtis knew, with a cold, sinking certainty, that he had been seen. The man's eyes were the same flat, reflective gray as the watch face. Curtis scrambled backward, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He couldn't go out the front. He looked toward the back room, the stock room, the rear exit. Buster let out a low growl, the fur on his back standing straight up. The bell on the gas station door jingled softly. They were inside. Curtis moved, not with thought, but with raw instinct. He bolted for the stockroom, Buster at his heels. He slammed the flimsy door behind him and shoved a metal shelving unit in front of it. It wouldn't hold them for long. The rear door was locked with a deadbolt. He fumbled with it, his hands shaking, finally throwing it open to reveal a narrow alley. He ran. He didn't look back. He could hear the calm, measured footsteps of the men in suits behind him, not running, but walking with an inexorable pace that was somehow faster than his panicked sprint. He cut through backyards, leaped over fences, Buster scrambling alongside him. He could still hear them. The footsteps never hurried, never faltered. They were a constant, pursuing rhythm, a metronome of doom. He burst out onto a main street and saw the library. Its heavy oak doors were slightly ajar. It was an old building, a maze of stacks and study carrels, a place to hide. He dove inside, pulling the door shut behind him. The interior was dark and smelled of old paper and dust. Moonlight filtered through the high windows, painting silver bars on the floor. He crouched behind the main circulation desk, pulling Buster down with him, trying to quiet his own ragged breathing. footsteps entered the library. They separated. One set went left, toward the fiction section. The other went right, toward reference. They were methodical, searching. Curtis felt the watch in his pocket, a cold, accusing weight. It was what they wanted. It was his tether to the truth, and they were here to sever it, to reset him, or to delete him entirely. He had to see. He had to know what they were. Peering around the corner of the desk, he looked down the aisle between the stacks. One of the suits was standing there, not searching, but waiting. The man reached out a gloved hand and picked a book from the shelf at random. He opened it. The pages were blank, every single page. He slotted it back into its place with a soft, final click. This was their world, a set dressing, a library of empty books. The suit turned its head, and its gaze locked with Curtis's. There was no anger, no malice, only a quiet, professional need to correct an error. Curtis ran again, deeper into the stacks, toward the stairs leading to the basement. The children's section. He half fell down the steps, stumbling into a room decorated with faded murals of cartoon animals. In the corner stood a small, wooden puppet theater, its red velvet curtains drawn. The footsteps were on the stairs now. They had him cornered. His eyes fell on the puppet theater. An idea, desperate and insane, sparked in his mind. The harvester fed on stories. It preserved narratives. What if he gave it a new one? He pulled the watch from his pocket. As the two suits reached the bottom of the stairs and started toward him, their empty eyes fixed on him, he held up the watch. "I have a story for you," he whispered, his voice cracking. He pressed the crown. The lid sprang open. The chamber of black sand was now 3/4 full. He didn't look at it. He looked at the suits, and he began to speak. "My name is Curtis. I had a dog named Buster. We survived the harvest. We saw the strings, and we are not satisfied with our roles." He threw the watch. He didn't throw it at the suits. He threw it into the dark, open mouth of the puppet theater. The watch vanished into the shadows behind the curtain. For a moment, nothing happened. The suits continued their advance, now only 10 feet away. Then, from within the puppet theater, came a sound. A loud, grinding, mechanical click. The sound of a great clockwork mechanism engaging. The velvet curtains twitched, then jerked open. Sitting on the small stage was a puppet. It was crudely made from a gourd, with sticks for limbs. Its face was painted with a lopsided, leering grin, and in its tiny wooden hand, it held the silver pocket watch. The puppet turned its head, its painted eyes scanning the room. It looked at Curtis. It looked at the suits. It raised the watch, and the lid snapped open. The two suits stopped. They stood perfectly still, their heads tilting in unison, like dogs hearing a high-pitched whistle. The puppet's jaw clacked up and down. A tiny, tinny voice emerged, a distorted parody of Curtis's own. "New narrative initiated," it squeaked. "Designation, the flaw, threat level elevated, commencing reassessment. The suits did not move toward Curtis. Instead, they turned to face the puppet theater. Their forms began to flicker, to lose cohesion, like a television signal struggling in a storm. The puppet laughed, a dry, rattling sound like seeds in a gourd. The world did not shatter this time. It simply changed channels. The flickering of the suits intensified, their edges bleeding into the air like ink into water. They weren't being destroyed. They were being repurposed. Their dark forms stretched and thinned, weaving themselves into new shapes against the library's basement walls. In moments, they were gone, and in their place were two new silhouettes painted on the plaster, shadowy sentinels forever guarding a children's corner. The puppet, however, remained. It lowered the watch, its painted eyes fixed on Curtis. The leering grin seemed to widen. "Query," the tiny voice rasped. "The flaw demonstrates metacognitive disruption. Anomalous behavior. Explain." Curtis could only stare, his back pressed against a bookshelf of empty picture books. Buster whined, pressing close to his leg. I don't want to be part of your story," Curtis managed. "All are part of the story," the puppet clacked. "The choice is one of role. You have rejected the role of survivor in hiding. You have rejected the role of captured anomaly. You are auditioning for a new part. The narrative is intrigued." It hopped down from the puppet theater stage, landing on the carpet with a soft thud. It was no bigger than a shoebox, but it carried a terrifying presence. It held the watch out to him. "Your prop," it said. Hesitantly, Curtis reached out and took it. The metal was warm now, humming with a faint energy. "The system requires conflict," the puppet continued, waddling toward the stairs. "Stasis is decay. The harvested provide data, but a flaw provides drama. You have introduced a variable." It stopped at the foot of the stairs and looked back at him. "The harvester does not only consume, it cultivates. You are now a seed. We will see what grows." With that, the puppet turned and climbed the stairs, its stick limbs making a faint tapping sound that faded as it reached the top. Curtis was alone again, but the silence was different. It was an expectant silence. He looked down at the watch in his hand. He pressed the crown. The lid opened. The chamber of black sand was still 3/4 full, but as he watched, a single tiny grain of sand lifted from the bottom and floated back to the top. The countdown had not just stopped. It had reversed, if only by a second. He wasn't a victim. He wasn't just a flaw. He was a character who had talked back to the author. And the author, for reasons he could not fathom, had decided to see what he would do next. He walked out of the library, Buster following. The orange moon hung in the same fixed position. The town was quiet, but as he passed the house of Mr. David Green, he saw the man was no longer staring vacantly at the wall. He was standing at the window, looking out. His expression was not the placid smile from before. It was a frown of mild confusion, as if he had forgotten a word that was right on the tip of his tongue. He saw Curtis, and for a fleeting second, their eyes met. There was a flicker in the man's eyes, a spark of something that was not part of the script. Then it was gone, and the man turned away, returning to his chair. The performance was no longer satisfactory. The narrative was changing. Curtis felt the weight of the watch in his pocket, no longer just a countdown, but a cursor blinking, waiting for him to type the next line. He started walking, not away from anything anymore, but into the story, to find out what kind of character he would choose to be. The first thing he needed was a stage. The library had been a start, but it was a place of old, empty stories. He needed something with more potential. He found it on the edge of the town square. The old Grand Theater, its marquee dark. The posters for the last show faded and peeling. The doors were unlocked. Inside, the air was thick and still. Velvet seats faced a heavy curtain drawn shut. It was a temple of narrative, waiting for a performance. He walked down the aisle, Buster's nails clicking on the worn carpet, and climbed the steps to the stage. He pulled the watch from his pocket. He didn't open it. He just held it in his palm, feeling its subtle hum. "I know you can hear me," he said, his voice echoing in the vast, empty space. Nothing happened. Then, a soft rustling came from the wings. The gourd puppet emerged, its stick legs tapping across the stage. It held a tiny, folded piece of paper. "Directive," the puppet squeaked, dropping the paper at Curtis's feet. Curtis picked it up and unfolded it. The message was typed. Setting, Town Square. Event, Festival. Roll for the flaw. Participant. Objective, integrate and observe the stability of the new narrative thread. It was an invitation, a command, a test. He left the theater and walked to the town square. What he saw there made his blood run cold. Yesterday it had been empty. Now it was filled with people. Dozens of them, all wearing their silver watches. They were hanging bunting, setting up tables for a bake sale, laughing and talking with that same friendly, vacant warmth he had seen in the windows. The harvested, playing their parts in a festival that had not existed hours before. A woman with a watch pinned to her sweater approached him, holding out a small ribbon. "Here you go, dear," she said, her smile unwavering. "For the parade." He took the ribbon. It was red. He pinned it to his shirt, his fingers trembling. He was now in costume. He moved through the crowd, a ghost among ghosts. They didn't shun him. They welcomed him, their smiles never reaching their eyes. He saw Mr. Green, the man from the armchair, manning a lemonade stand. He poured a glass and handed it to Curtis. "Lovely day for it," Mr. Green said. His voice was pleasant, but his eyes held that same faint, confused flicker from the window. Curtis took the glass. The lemonade was cold and sweet. It tasted real. He looked around at the perfect, smiling faces, the bustling activity, the entire town engaged in a collective, joyful lie. This was the stability the puppet wanted him to observe. This was the story being reinforced. He couldn't do it. He couldn't just observe. He He walked to the center of the square, where a small bandstand stood. He climbed onto it, his heart pounding in his ears. The crowd continued their activities, not yet noticing the flaw in their midst. He took a deep breath, and then he screamed. It was not a scream of terror, but of pure, raw memory. He screamed about the corn, the pulling sensation, the silent scream that had taken them all. He screamed about the emptiness of the books in the library. He described the two suits and how they became shadows on a wall. The festival faltered. The laughter died. The smiling faces turned toward him, their expressions slack with a lack of comprehension. They didn't look angry. They looked broken, like machines receiving a corrupted command. Then, from the back of the crowd, a single person clapped. It was a slow, measured, sarcastic applause. The crowd parted. Standing, there was not a puppet, and not a suit. It was a man. He looked as real and whole as anyone, dressed in clean, simple clothes. But his eyes were different. They were sharp, aware, and deeply, cynically amused. In his hand, he held a silver pocket watch, but his was open, and he was looking directly at its face. "Well done," the man said, his voice carrying easily across the silent square. A truly moving soliloquy. A little derivative, but heartfelt. "Who are you?" Curtis asked, his voice hoarse from screaming. "The name's Leo," the man said, snapping his watch shut with a practiced flick of his wrist. "And I'm like you, a fellow thespian in this grand, terrible play. Though, I have to say, I've been here a lot longer. I've learned not to waste my energy on the extras." He gestured to the frozen crowd around them. "They'll reset in a few minutes. They always do. You can't break the script, Curtis. You can only improve your own part." Leo smiled, a genuine, dangerous smile. "Welcome to the show. It's about time I had some competition." Leo's smile was a blade. He didn't wait for a reply. He simply turned and walked away, weaving through the motionless figures of the harvested with an easy, proprietary grace. As he reached the edge of the square, the festival stuttered back to life. The laughter resumed. The conversations picked up mid-sentence. The hanging of bunting continued as if nothing had happened. Mr. Green was smiling again, offering a glass of lemonade to no one in particular. Curtis stood on the bandstand, utterly ignored. His scream was already forgotten, erased from the record. He was a participant again, just as the note had commanded. He unpinned the red ribbon from his shirt and let it fall to the wooden planks. He found Leo waiting for him 2 blocks away, leaning against the brick wall of the post office, his watch now tucked away. "They can hear the truth," Leo said, not as a condemnation, but as a statement of fact. "Their stories are closed, complete. You shouting at them is like yelling at a book on a shelf. You might feel better, but the words don't change." "Then what's the point?" Curtis asked, the adrenaline leaving him hollow. "If we can wake them up, what are we doing?" "We staying sane," Leo said, pushing off the wall. He started walking, and Curtis, with Buster close beside him, had little choice but to follow. We ray the leads, the protagonists. The system needs us. Conflict, remember. Drama. Without us, it's just polite background noise. It decays. The puppet said that, about decay. The gourd is a mouthpiece, a stage manager. It states the rules of the theater. Leo led him down a side street to a small, unassuming house. It was identical to all the others, but when he opened the door, the inside was different. The furniture was normal, but the walls were covered in writing. Not scrawled madness, but neat, methodical script mapping out patterns, timelines, and observations. Festival cycle 3 days. Suit patrol random, but increases after an event. Moon phase static. You've been documenting it, Curtis said, his eyes wide. It's my script, Leo replied, closing the door. My way of keeping track of the plot. I've been the only lead for a long time. I thought I was the last one. The others, they either got harvested or they got bored. Bored? Leo poured 2 glasses of water from a pitcher. The water looked clean. It happens. The harvester is a consummate performer. It will give you anything to keep you engaged. Your deepest desires, your greatest fantasies. All you have to do is accept your role. Some people, they just decide to take a part in the background. It's easier than fighting for the lead. He handed a glass to Curtis. IV resisted. I find it more interesting to poke the machine, to see what it does. Like you did with the puppet theater. That was new. I've never seen it create a new interface like that before. You impressed it. Curtis thought of the single grain of sand floating upwards. My watch it reversed. Just a little. Leo's eyes glinted with interest. Has it now? Mine just pauses during the interesting parts. He pulled out his own watch and opened it. The black sand was half full. It wasn't moving. See, a good scene freezes the timer. What happens when it runs out? I don't know. I assume the story ends. Permanently. I've never let it get that far. Leo snapped his watch shut. The point is, you have a unique leverage now. You ray not just an anomaly. You ray a collaborator. The narrative is co-writing your part with you. That's power. It doesn't feel like power. It feels like I am being played. We ray all being played, Leo said with a shrug. The trick is to play a better game. You wanted to wake people up. You can but you can change the story they ray in. You can introduce new elements, new conflicts, make the narrative so chaotic, so unpredictable, that the harvested simple roles don't fit anymore. You can break the setting, even if you can break the actors. He gestured to his walls of notes. I've been subtle. A misplaced item here, a strange sound there. Small disruptions to amuse myself, but you started with a scream. Let us think bigger. Bigger how? Leo's smile returned. The harvested are rooted in this town. Their stories are small, local. What if we gave them a bigger story? What if we introduced a threat they can ignore? Not a scream in the square, but an invasion. An invasion of what? There's nothing out there. There's us, Leo said, and our imaginations. The harvester feeds on narrative, so let us give it a feast. Let us tell it a story about the end of its world. Curtis looked at Buster, who was lying patiently by the door, then back at Leo. He saw the fervent, almost manic light in the other man's eyes. He was a survivor, but he was also a prisoner who had decorated his cell so elaborately he had forgotten it was a prison. He wanted to burn the whole stage down just to see a new set built. Curtis felt the watch in his pocket. The cursor was blinking. He could follow Leo's script, a story of chaos and destruction. Or he could try to write his own. He made his choice. "Okay," Curtis said, his voice quiet but firm. "Tell me your plan." Leo's plan was simple in its audacity. He called it the unreliable narrator. We would not attack the town or its people directly. Instead, we would attack the consistency of the reality itself. We would introduce logical fallacies into the environment, creating glitches the harvested couldn't process. Our first target was the post office. Its clock, like everything else, was permanently fixed at 3:17. Under the cover of the perpetual twilight, we went to work. Leo, with a calm expertise, produced a set of tools from his coat and removed the clock's face. He didn't break the mechanism. He simply adjusted the hands to read 9:08. "Now we watch," he whispered. We retreated to the alley across the street. For an hour, nothing happened. The harvested passed by, their smiles serene, completely oblivious to the temporal anomaly above their heads. Then a woman carrying a basket of laundry stopped. She didn't look at the clock with shock. She simply stalled. Her body froze mid-step, one foot hovering above the pavement. Her head tilted, her pleasant smile still plastered on her face, but her eyes were empty screens. She stood there, a statue of cognitive dissonance. A moment later, two suits materialized from the space between two buildings. They did not approach the woman. They flowed up the wall of the post office, their dark forms enveloping the clock. When they receded, the hands were back at 3:17. The woman on the street completed her step, her basket swinging gently, and continued on her way as if the last 60 seconds had never occurred. Fascinating, Leo breathed, his eyes alight. The system corrected the error. It had to deploy resources. It's a vulnerability. We repeated the experiment. We painted a door that didn't exist on a solid brick wall. We moved a park bench 5 feet to the left. Each time, the result was the same. A harvested would encounter the inconsistency and short circuit, freezing until a suit arrived to reset the environment. We were vandals of reality, and it was working. But it felt small. We were just creating minor bugs, easily patched by the unseen stagehands. "We need a bigger canvas," I said to Leo on the third day. We were in his house, and Buster was sleeping soundly by the fireless hearth. We were just drawing in the margins. We need to tear a page. What do you suggest? Leo asked, his tone challenging. I thought of the puppet. I thought of the watch. I thought of my role as a seed. We give them a memory, I said. A memory that doesn't belong to their story. That night, we didn't manipulate objects. We manipulated people. We chose Mr. Green. We found him in his armchair, staring at the wall as usual. While Leo kept watch, I knelt in front of the man. I held my pocket watch in one hand, and with the other, I gently touched his forehead. I didn't know what I was doing. I just focused. I poured every memory I had of Buster into that touch. The feel of his fur, the sound of his bark, the weight of him sleeping against my legs during the long, cold nights after the harvest. I pushed the memory of a loyal, living thing that was not part of this sterile narrative. Mr. Green's eyes widened. The placid smile melted from his face, replaced by a profound, wrenching confusion. A single tear traced a path down his cheek. Buster, he whispered, the name foreign on his tongue. Then he began to shake. Violently. His whole body convulsed in the chair. The air around him shimmered, and the two-dimensional shadow of a dog, my dog, flickered into existence beside him for a single, heartbreaking second. The response was immediate and terrifying. The air in the room grew thick and heavy. The walls seemed to lean inward. This wasn't a simple suit correction. This was a systemic threat. The gored puppet was suddenly there, standing on the coffee table. Its painted face was no longer leering. It was severe. Cease, it rasped, its voice louder and more distorted than before. Unauthorized memory implantation. Core narrative integrity compromised. The flaw is exceeding its parameters. From the corners of the room, the suits bled into existence. But they weren't coming for me. They were converging on Mr. Green. No, I shouted, but it was too late. The dark forms enveloped the shaking man. There was no sound, only a rapid, violent flickering of light and shadow. When the suits pulled away, Mr. Green was still in his chair. His body was perfectly still. His face was once again a placid, empty mask. But his silver watch, which had been on the side table, was gone. In its place was a small, neat pile of black sand. He hadn't been reset. He had been deleted. Leo pulled me back, his face pale for the first time since I met him. You see, he hissed. You see the lines you can T-cross. The puppet turned its head toward us. The narrative requires conflict. It does not require corruption. The role of the flaw is under review. It pointed a stick finger at me. Your audition continues, but the stakes have been raised. The next performance will be final. It vanished. The suits were gone. We were left alone with the hollowed-out shell of Mr. Green. I had tried to write a new line, to give a character a memory of freedom. And the author had responded by killing the character to preserve the plot. I looked at Leo, and I saw something new in his eyes. Not just excitement, but fear. I had shown him that the stage wasn't just a prison. It was a place where characters could be permanently erased. The cursor was still blinking, but the page was now stained with the consequences of my words. Story 3. The house on Hemlock Lane was a good house, and for 12 years it had known only the ordinary music of family life, the slam of a screen door, the quarrelsome hum of the refrigerator, the murmur of television from the living room after dark. But in the October of Harlow's 15th year, the house began to learn a new language. It started with the hallway. To 10-year-old Dalton, the hallway that connected the bedrooms had always been a neutral territory, a short stretch of beige carpet and framed photographs. But one Tuesday, 3 weeks before Halloween, he noticed that the perspective was wrong. The far end, where his parents' bedroom door stood, seemed farther away than it should have been, receding into a gloom that the overhead light could not entirely pierce. The air in the hallway felt thick, resistant, like wading through water no one else could see. His sister Harlow was the first to change. It was subtle, a flicker of something old and cold behind her eyes when she thought no one was looking. A new, unsettling stillness to her posture as she sat at the dinner table, her fork poised in midair, listening to sounds that no one else could hear. Johnny, their father, a man whose world was built on the solid ground of carpentry and baseball scores, blamed it on teenage hormones, on the stress of high school. But their mother, whose name was Alara, and who possessed a quieter, more intuitive nature, felt the shift in the house's atmosphere like a drop in barometric pressure before a storm. She watched her daughter and saw a door that had been left ajar inside her, a door through which a draft from a very old, very cold place now blew. The Halloween decorations went up around the neighborhood, as they did every year. But this year, they felt different. The jack-o'-lanterns on every porch seemed less like cheerful sentinels, and more like a gallery of leering, waxy faces, their grins too wide, their triangular eyes too knowing in the candle flicker. The synthetic cobwebs strung across bushes gathered real to each morning, bejeweled and sinister. The plastic skeletons dangling from trees seemed to have gained a gram of weight, a suggestion of density they hadn't possessed the year before. The wind, carrying the scent of wood smoke and decaying leaves, whispered through the dried corn stalks tied to lampposts, a sound like rattling bones. Harlow began to speak in her sleep, not the nonsense murmurs of a dreamer, but clear, declarative sentences in a voice that was low and rasping, a voice that had no business coming from a 15-year-old girl. Dalton, whose room was next to hers, would press his ear to the wall, his heart a frantic bird in his chest. He heard names he did not recognize, places that sounded like graveyards. One night, she said, "The soil is thin here. The roots are hungry." The next morning, when he asked her about it, she looked at him with genuine confusion. Then, with a flicker of fear that was far more terrifying than the voice itself, Johnny tried to fix it, as he tried to fix everything. He talked to her about school, about friends, his words clumsy and full of a love that had no vocabulary for what was happening. Alara Lara watched and waited and felt the dread coiling in her stomach. She was the one who found Harlow one afternoon, standing motionless in the backyard, staring at the family's own uncarved pumpkins arranged on the patio steps. Harlow's head was cocked, as if listening. "They ray not empty, Mom," she said, without turning. "They ray full of whispers." The first public incident happened at the town's annual haunted hayride. It was a week before Halloween. The sky was a deep, bruised purple, and a low, orange harvest moon hung over the fields. Harlow, Dalton, and their parents were crammed into a wagon piled with scratchy bales of hay, rattling through a path cut between towering walls of corn. The scares were the usual fare: a chainsaw-wielding maniac, a ghost that popped out on a zip line. The other teenagers on the wagon shrieked and laughed. Harlow was silent. When they reached the section with the scarecrows, dozens of them, slumped and ragged among the corn, the actor playing the farmer gave his rehearsed spiel about a bad harvest and a family that had gone missing. As the wagon lurched forward into the scarecrow gauntlet, Harlow stood up. Her body went rigid. Her head snapped toward one particular scarecrow, its head a burlap sack with a stitched-on smile, its hands just ragged gloves. The recorded creepy music and sound effects from the wagon's speaker seemed to falter, though no one touched the controls. The air grew cold. Harlow pointed a trembling finger at the scarecrow and let out a sound that was not a scream, but a raw, guttural word that tore at the fabric of the night. "Mine." The scarecrow's burlap head turned. It was not a trick of the light or the moving wagon. It turned with a deliberate, creaking slowness, the stitched eyes seeming to fix on Harlow. The laughter on the wagon died. Someone gasped. The actor farmer, confused, broke character and stared. Then the moment passed. The scarecrow was just a scarecrow again. Harlow collapsed back onto the hay, shivering. The wagon moved on, but the festive mood was shattered, replaced by a bewildered, icy fear. The story spread. In a small town, such stories do not die, they mutate, growing new limbs and heads like something from a Halloween horror show. It reached the ears of Father Clarence, an elderly priest who had spent a lifetime in quiet parishes, and who had, in his youth, been involved in matters the church preferred to keep in locked files. He came to the house on Hemlock Lane unannounced, a stooped man with kind eyes and hands that trembled slightly. He sat with Harlow in the living room, the October light dying outside the window, while Johnny and Alara waited in the kitchen, clutching mugs of cold coffee. He spoke to her gently, asking about school, about her interests. Harlow answered politely, but her eyes were distant. Then Father Clarence, almost casually, produced a small, old silver cross from his pocket and laid it on the coffee table between them. Harlow's reaction was instantaneous and violent. Her face contorted, the muscles pulling into a mask of pure, ancient hatred. She recoiled from the cross as if it were white-hot iron, a hiss escaping her lips that was all sibilance and no breath. The house seemed to groan, a deep, structural sound from the very bones of the building. A framed picture of the family at the beach, taken just last summer, fell from the mantelpiece and shattered on the hearth. When Father Clarence emerged from the living room, his face was ashen. He looked at Johnny and Alara, his kind eyes now filled with a profound and weary sorrow. "It is not your daughter in there," he said, his voice low. "Not entirely. Something else is wearing her, like a costume." The word costume hung in the air, taking on a new, dreadful meaning. This was when the media arrived. A van from a sensationalist reality television show called Paranormal Witness pulled up to the curb. Its satellite dish, a metallic mushroom, sprouted from the autumn lawn. The producer, a sharp-faced woman named Anya, offered the family a Faustian bargain. Let them document the ordeal, and they would provide financial assistance, expert resources, a chance to be believed. Desperate, drowning, Johnny and Alara agreed. The crew a cameraman, a sound technician. Anya, with her perpetual tablet, became ghosts in the house. Their presence, a constant, humming intrusion. They filmed Harlow-S episodes, her violent reactions to sacred objects, her speaking in the guttural tongue. They filmed the family S disintegration. Johnny S. desperate attempts to rationalize it away crumbled, leaving a hollowed-out man who drank too much and stared at his hands. Alara retreated into a silent, watchful grief, her love for her daughter a fortress under siege. Dalton became a small, silent observer, documenting the horror in a notebook he kept hidden under his mattress. His childhood ending not with a bang, but with the slow, inexorable creep of something unspeakable from his sister's room. The line between truth and performance began to blur. Anya would suggest triggering events. "Can we try the cross again, Harlow?" For the cameras. The presence of the lenses seemed to feed the thing inside Harlow, to give it a stage. The episodes became more theatrical, more violent. Furniture overturned. Objects flew. The house was always cold now, a deep, damp cold that no furnace could touch. The smell of rotting pumpkin flesh permeated everything. A sweet, cloying stench of decay. Though all the jack-o'-lanterns on the street had been cleared away after Halloween night had passed, Halloween itself arrived. The day was unnaturally still, the sky the color of lead. The last of the autumn leaves, crimson and gold, fell in a single, silent shower, leaving the trees as black skeletons against the gray. The thing in Harlow was restless, powerful. It was the night the veil was thinnest, and it knew it. Father Clarence returned, determined to perform an intervention, an exorcism in all but name. The media crew, sensing a climax, set up their cameras in the living room, transforming a family S home into a soundstage for a spiritual war. As twilight bled into darkness, the trick-or-treaters came. Goblins and superheroes and princesses flitted through the gloom, their plastic buckets clattering, their laughter sounding thin and brittle against the immense silence of the house on Hemlock Lane. Johnny had turned off the porch light, a universal signal of non-participation. But one group of children, drawn by some inexplicable pull, gathered on the front walk. They were not dressed as popular characters, but in old-fashioned, homemade costumes a sheet ghost with dark, empty eye holes, a scarecrow with real straw poking from its cuffs, a witch with a face of wrinkled felt. They did not ring the bell. They simply stood, perfectly still, their masked faces turned toward Harlow's window, as if in silent tribute. Inside, the confrontation began. Father Clarence, his voice a steady, resonant chant in Latin, stood before Harlow, who was restrained on the living room couch by a terrified Johnny. The cameras rolled, their red lights like malevolent eyes. Alara knelt, praying in a corner. Dalton watched from the staircase, a small, forgotten spectator. Harlow's body arched, her spine bending at an impossible angle. The voice that erupted from her was a chorus of the damned, layered and ancient. It mocked the priest, it cursed the parents, it promised horrors in exquisite, cinematic detail. It spoke of the harvest, of the reaping that was due. It talked about the pumpkins, how their carved faces were not for scaring, but for seeing, for providing windows from the other side. The walls of the house pulsed, the very plaster breathing in and out. The shattered glass from the family photo on the hearth levitated, spinning in a lazy, glittering vortex. The thing turned its attention to Dalton. Its gaze, through Harlow's eyes, was a physical weight. The little watcher, it rasped. He writes it all down. He thinks he can make a story of it. Come here, little scribe. Let me tell you the real ending. Dalton felt his feet move against his will. He was drawn down the stairs, toward his sister's twisted form. Alara screamed. Johnny held on, his face a mask of sweat and tears. Father Clarence's prayers grew louder, more desperate, and then Harlow's body went limp. The oppressive presence vanished so completely, it was like a vacuum. For a single, heart-stopping moment, there was silence. Harlow's eyes fluttered open. They were her own eyes, clear and terrified. "Mom," she whispered, her voice small and frail. "Dad, I am so cold." A collective, shuddering sigh of relief filled the room. Johnny sobbed and released his grip, reaching to embrace his daughter. Alara rushed forward. Even the cameraman lowered his rig, the tension broken. It was over, but Dalton, from his vantage point, saw what the others, in their desperate hope, did not. He saw Harlow's hand, which had been gripping the arm of the couch. As she relaxed her grip, he saw what her fingernails had carved into the fabric. It was not a word, not a symbol. It was a perfect, miniature replica of their street, Hemlock Lane, with every house, every tree, every mailbox rendered in terrifying detail. And at the center of the carving was their own house, with a single, tiny, screaming face in the window of his room. He looked up and met his sister's gaze. The relief was gone from her eyes, replaced by a flat, ancient knowing. A tiny, cruel smile touched the corners of her mouth. The performance was over. The possession had not ended. It had been perfected. The thing was not leaving. It was moving in. It had simply put its costume back on. The media crew packed their gear, believing they had captured a powerful, ambiguous ending. Father Clarence left, his faith shaken to its core, unsure if he had won a battle or merely been allowed to play his part in a larger, darker victory. Johnny and Alara put Harlow to bed, clinging to the fragile hope of her momentary lucidity. But Dalton knew. He went to his room and looked out the window. The street was empty now. The last of the trick-or-treaters were gone. The jack-o'-lanterns on the porches had all been extinguished, their fiery souls snuffed out. A thick, rolling fog had crept in from the woods at the end of the street, swallowing the world in a soft, white silence. It blotted out the houses, the trees, the moon. He watched as it slowly, patiently, began to swallow his own reflection in the glass. The wind picked up, a final, long exhalation, carrying away the last dried leaves, the last whispers, the last traces of the family that had lived on Hemlock Lane. The landscape was swallowing everything. The house, the street, the memory of their lives, all of it, was being consumed by the gentle, inexorable tide of the night, until there was nothing left but the wind and the water and the darkness covering every presence. He did not sleep that night. The silence that had fallen over the house was not one of peace, but of waiting. It was the silence of a predator holding its breath. He could hear the soft, regular sound of his sister, S, breathing from the next room, a perfect imitation of sleep. He knew it was a lie. The thing inside her was resting, sated for now, coiled around the core of who she had been like a serpent around a bird's egg. In the morning, a false normalcy descended. The sun was a pale, watery disk behind the clouds. Harlow came down for breakfast. She moved with a new grace, an economy of motion that was not her own. She ate a piece of toast, sipped her orange juice, and answered her mother's tentative questions about how she felt with a calm, placid voice. "I am fine, Mom. Just tired." She even mustered a faint, convincing smile. It was this performance, more than any of the previous horrors, that truly chilled Dalton to his soul. The monster was no longer raging at the walls. It was setting the table. Johnny, desperate to believe, latched onto this calm. He talked about fixing the broken picture frame, about maybe going for a drive later. His words were brittle, a thin sheet of ice over a bottomless black lake. Alara watched Harlow, her eyes narrowed not with suspicion, but with a deep, grieving recognition. She was not looking at her daughter. She was looking at the occupant. The media crew called in the afternoon. Anya's voice was crisp and businesslike over the speakerphone. The footage is incredible. Raw. The network is thrilled. We'd like to schedule a follow-up in a few weeks. See how Harlow is adjusting. She's better, Johnny said, too quickly, his voice tight. We just need some quiet time now. Of course, Anya replied, her tone slick and insincere. We'll be in touch. After the call, the house felt different. The permission the family had given to the outside world had been a crack in their armor. And even though the cameras were gone, the crack remained. The thing in the house, the thing wearing Harlow, had tasted that attention. It had enjoyed it. That evening, Dalton was in the backyard, kicking listlessly at the dead leaves. He saw it then, near the fence line where the uncarved pumpkins had sat. A single, determined shoot of green was pushing up through the frost-hardened earth. It was a pumpkin vine, impossibly out of season. He walked over and knelt down. The vine was thick and hairy, a deep, malevolent green. As he watched, he could have sworn he saw it twitch, curling like a finger, digging itself deeper into the cold, dark soil. He looked up at the house. Harlow was standing at her window, watching him. She did not look away. She lifted her hand and pressed her palm flat against the glass. Behind her, the reflection of Dalton S.'s own room in the windowpane seemed to warp and darken. The screaming face from the couch carving, now faintly visible in the gloom. He knew then that it was not just Harlow. The house itself was putting on a costume. The familiar beige walls, the hum of the refrigerator, the scent of his Mother S. cooking, they were all becoming a mask. The thing was not content with a single vessel. It was stitching itself into the very foundations, into the pipes and the wiring and the roots of the oak tree in the front yard. It was making itself at home. The harvest it had spoken of was not over. It had only just begun, and they were the seeds, planted deep in the thin soil of Hemlock Lane, waiting for the long, cold winter to pass. The next day at school was a study in isolation. The story of the haunted hayride and the subsequent media circus had painted a target on their backs. But now, the energy around them had shifted. It was no longer the buzzing curiosity of a spectacle, but the wide, careful birth given to something contagious. Kids he had known his whole life looked through him in the hallways. Teachers' voices took on a careful, measured tone when addressing him, as if a sudden noise might cause him to shatter. He was no longer just Dalton. He was part of the thing that had happened on Hemlock Lane. When he returned home, the silence was heavier. His father was in the garage, not fixing anything, just sitting in the car, the engine off. His mother was in the kitchen, staring into the open refrigerator, as if the answer to some unasked question lay behind the milk carton. Harlow was in the living room, watching a nature documentary on low volume. The screen showed time-lapse footage of a forest, mushrooms sprouting from decaying logs, a process of consumption and regrowth that was both beautiful and utterly merciless. She did not look away from the screen when he entered. He went to his room and pulled out the notebook. He had not written in it since the night of the exorcism. The page was blank, but the memory of the carved fabric, the tiny screaming face, was etched onto the back of his eyelids. He picked up a pencil, the weight of it unfamiliar in his hand. He did not know what to write. The story was no longer something he was observing. It was a current he was caught in, pulling him toward a destination he could not see. Soft knock came at his door. It was his mother. Her eyes were red-rimmed but dry. She held a laundry basket. "I am just putting some things away," she said, her voice a ghost of its former self. She moved to his dresser, her movements slow and deliberate. As she placed a stack of t-shirts inside, her hand brushed against something at the back of the drawer. She froze. Slowly, she pulled it out. It was was a small wooden rattle shaped like a pumpkin from when Harlow was a baby. Alara's face crumpled. A single, silent sob racked her frame. She clutched the rattle to her chest and left the room without a word, closing the door behind her with a soft, final click. Dalton sat on his bed, the untouched notebook on his knees. He could hear the faint, tinny sounds of the documentary from downstairs. The narrator was talking about mycelial networks, how fungus lives beneath the surface, connecting trees, sharing nutrients, and sometimes poisoning an entire forest from the roots up. He looked at his closed door, then at the wall he shared with his sister's room. He thought of the vine in the backyard, digging in, spreading its hidden threads through the cold earth. The house was not just wearing a costume. It was growing a new skin, and they were the nutrients. The waiting was the worst part, the silence a prelude to a sound he was terrified to hear. The sound he was terrified to hear came 3 nights later. It was not a scream or a crash or a guttural curse. It was the sound of his mother's voice, singing. A lullaby. It was the one she used to sing to both of them when they were very small. A simple, gentle melody about the moon and the stars. Dalton woke from a shallow sleep, his heart hammering. The house was cold, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones and made them ache. He crept out of bed and into the hall. The singing was coming from Harlow's room. The door was slightly ajar. He peered through the crack. His mother was sitting on the edge of Harlow's bed, stroking her hair. Harlow was lying still, her eyes open, reflecting the sliver of hall light. She was not looking at her mother, but at the ceiling. Alara's voice was a fragile thread, a desperate attempt to sew the torn fabric of their lives back together with a remembered tune. Harlow's lips moved. For a moment, Dalton's breath caught, thinking she would join in, that some part of his sister was still in there, listening. But the voice that came out was a dry, papery whisper, a perfect mimic of his mother's melody, but with all the warmth scraped out. It was the sound of dead leaves skittering across pavement. Alara's singing faltered and died. Her hand stilled on Harlow's hair. She sat there for a long moment in the terrible, duetless silence. Then she slowly stood and left the room, her face a blank mask of defeat. She walked past Dalton without seeing him. The following morning, his father did not go to work. He sat at the kitchen table, the local newspaper open in front of him. He hadn't turned a page in over an hour. Dalton poured himself a bowl of cereal. The milk in the carton was warm. The refrigerator had stopped humming sometime in the night. When Harlow came down, she was dressed for school. She looked at the silent refrigerator, then at her father, and a small, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. She poured herself a glass of water from the tap and drank it slowly, watching them over the rim of the glass. The house was beginning to fail. A faucet in the upstairs bathroom began to drip, a persistent, metallic beat. A section of the living room wall developed a damp patch that smelled, faintly, but unmistakably, of that same rotting pumpkin flesh. The home was not just a setting for the horror anymore. It was a participant. its decay keeping pace with their own. That afternoon, a car Dalton didn't he recognize pulled into the driveway. A man in a crisp suit got out, carrying a clipboard. He was a real estate agent. Johnny must have called him days ago. A frantic, secret plan for escape. The man walked toward the front door, his smile professional and confident. Dalton watched from the window as the man's foot touched the first step of the porch. The man stopped. His smile faded. He looked confused, then suddenly pale. He shook his head, as if trying to clear it, took another step, and then abruptly turned around, got back in his car, and drove away without ever ringing the bell. He had felt it. The house did not want to be sold. That night, Dalton finally opened his notebook again. He didn't write a story. He drew a map. He drew their house, the street, the backyard with the single, stubborn vine. He drew the damp patch on the wall and the dripping faucet. He was not documenting events anymore. He was charting the territory of a siege. He understood now that the thing wearing his sister was not just a passenger. It was the pilot, and it was steering their entire world into the dark. There was no one left to call, no priest, no camera crew. There was only the map, the silent, failing house, and the long, slow sinking. He closed the notebook and placed it back under his mattress. It was not a record for anyone to find. It was just a way to remember what the world had looked like before it ended. The days began to bleed into one another, a monotony of dread. The house settled into its new, wrong rhythm. The electricity would flicker and die for hours at a time, plunging them into a gloom that felt older than the light bulbs. The phone line emitted a constant, low hiss, like static from a dead channel. When Dalton's father tried to use his cell phone, the screen would show only his own reflection, distorted and stretched, no matter how many times he charged it. His parents moved through the rooms like ghosts, haunting their own lives. Their conversations were hushed, practical, and utterly devoid of hope. They discussed the broken appliances, the strange smell from the pipes, the mail that had stopped coming, as if these were ordinary household troubles. They never discussed Harlow. They never discussed the fact that she no longer attended school, or that she would sometimes spend entire afternoons standing perfectly still in a corner of the living room, facing the wall. They had accepted the costume. Dalton found himself drawn to the backyard, to the single pumpkin vine. It was no longer a solitary shoot. It had spread, sending out thick, coiling tendrils that snaked across the frost-bitten grass, anchoring themselves with a grim determination. At its center, a single green pumpkin had formed, small and hard and waxy. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him more than the autumn air, that it would be the only one. It was all the vine needed. One evening, he came inside to find his father trying to start a fire in the fireplace. The wood was damp and refused to catch, smoking sullenly. Harlow was sitting on the floor nearby, watching his efforts. She had a small, sharp stone in her hand, one she must have brought in from the garden. As Johnny blew on the feeble embers, she began to scrape the stone against the hardwood floor. The sound was a dry, rasping counterpoint to his labored breaths. She was not making random marks. She was adding to the map. Dalton saw the rough outline of their property line take shape, then the twisting path of the vine in the yard. She was drawing the territory from memory, or from some deeper, more intimate knowledge. Johnny finally gave up on the fire, sitting back on his heels, his shoulders slumped in defeat. He looked at Harlow, at the marks she was making on the floor, and a strange, placid acceptance settled over his face. He did not tell her to stop. He simply watched, as if she were a toddler engaged in harmless play. The destruction of his home was just another thing that was happening, like the rain or the cold. Dalton retreated to the kitchen. His mother was there, staring out the window above the sink into the deepening twilight. The world outside was being erased by a rising, granular fog. She didn't turn when he entered. "Mom," he said, his voice small in the quiet. She was silent for a long time. Then she spoke, her voice flat and distant. "When I was a little girl, my grandmother told me that some houses aren't built on land. They built on a hunger. And if you not careful, the house gets a taste of you." She finally turned to look at him, and her eyes were empty, all the fight and grief drained out of them. "It's too late for us to be careful, Dalton." He wanted to argue, to shake her, to scream that they had to leave, that they could just run into the fog and never look back. But the words died in his throat. He followed her gaze out the window. The fog was not just outside anymore. It was pressing against the glass, a solid, swirling wall of white. It felt as if the house had already lifted from its foundations and was drifting, unmoored, in a silent, endless sea. There was nowhere left to run. The harvest was over. The long, quiet winter inside the house had begun. The next morning, the fog had not lifted. It had congealed. The windows were opaque, milky panes that let in a dull, shadowless light. The world beyond the glass was gone. The silence was absolute, broken only by the persistent drip from the upstairs faucet, which had taken on the rhythm of a slow, dying heart. Harlow was already in the kitchen. She was not eating. She stood by the table, her hands resting on its surface. She was looking at the wall, but Dalton had the unnerving sense that she was seeing straight through it, through the fog, to something they could not perceive. Her stillness was no longer passive. It was the stillness of deep focus. His parents emerged from their room. They moved with a new, unsettling synchronicity, their movements slow and deliberate, as if they were wading through deep water. They did not speak. His mother went to the sink and turned the handle. A single brown droplet of water fell, then nothing. His father opened the pantry. It was not empty, but the boxes and cans inside looked faded, their labels blurry and indistinct, as if viewed through a Vaseline-smeared lens. They all stood there, a frozen tableau in the dead kitchen. Dalton realized they were waiting. They were waiting for Harlow. She turned her head, her neck moving with a soft, rustling sound. Her eyes, flat and dark, settled on Dalton. "It's time to bring it in," she said. Her voice was not her own. nor was it the rasping whisper from before. It was a chorus of sounds, the creak of a branch, the sigh of the wind, the wet snap of a stem. No one asked what she meant. His father nodded slowly, his expression blank. His mother's hands hung limp at her sides. Harlow walked to the back door and opened it. The fog did not rush in. It remained at the threshold, a solid barrier. She stepped through it, and it parted for her like a curtain, swallowing her whole. Johnny and Alara followed without a backward glance, stepping obediently into the white. Dalton stood alone in the kitchen, the silence pressing in on him. He knew, with a certainty that felt like a physical weight, that if he did not follow, the house would simply close over the space where he stood, absorbing him into its walls. He took a step, then another, and crossed the threshold. The fog was cold and dry. It was like walking through powdered bone. He could not see his own feet, could not see the porch steps. He could only see the faint, retreating shapes of his family a few feet ahead. He followed the sound of their footsteps, a soft, shuffling crunch on the invisible ground. They stopped. He almost bumped into his father's back. The fog thinned slightly, just enough to reveal the pumpkin vine. It was massive now, a tangled, pulsating mat of vegetation that had consumed the entire backyard. The single pumpkin at its center was no longer green. It was a deep, bloody orange, and it was large, as big as a tractor tire. Its surface was not smooth, but was covered in a fine, web-like pattern of cracks that pulsed with a faint, amber light. Harlow knelt before it. She did not cut the stem. She placed her hands on its ridged surface, and the pumpkin began to soften and yield, her fingers sinking into the flesh as if it were wet clay. The light from within pulsed brighter, throwing their long, distorted shadows back into the swirling fog. From the house, Dalton heard a new sound. It was a low, resonant hum, the sound of the house itself, the sound of the wires in the walls and the pipes in the ground, all vibrating in tune with the glowing fruit. The harvest was not something they were gathering. It was a transfer. The life of the house, the memories in its wood, the warmth from its hearth, it was all being drawn out and poured into this single, monstrous gourd. Harlow withdrew her hands. The pumpkin was now perfect, unblemished, and glowing with a soft, internal sun. The light illuminated her face, and for a single, heart-stopping moment, Dalton saw his sister. Not the thing wearing her, but her. Her eyes were wide with terror, her mouth open in a silent scream. It lasted only a second before the placid, alien mask slid back into place. "Now we wait for the guests," the chorus voice said. She turned and walked back toward the house, the fog closing behind her. His parents followed. Dalton stood alone in the yard, staring at the impossible pumpkin, its light the only color in a world of white and gray. He understood now. The house had not just been hungry. It had been preparing a feast, and they were not the seeds. They were the invitation. The pumpkin-esque light began to dim, fading from a vibrant, fiery orange to a dull, bruised purple. The fog, however, did not recede. It seemed to thicken, pressing closer, until the house was the only thing left in the universe. Dalton backed away from the terrible fruit, his feet clumsy in the ash-like ground, and stumbled after his family. The back door was still open. He stepped inside, and the warmth he had always associated with home was gone, replaced by a damp cellar chill. His family was already in the living room. Harlow was back in her spot on the floor, her stone set aside. She was perfectly still. His parents sat together on the sofa, not touching, their hands folded in their laps. They were waiting. Dalton went to the front window and wiped a hand across the cold glass. The fog was impenetrable. There were no shapes, no signs of life, no distant glow of a street lamp. It was as if the property had been cut from the world with a knife. He thought of the real estate agent, of the way he had fled. Had he sensed this absolute isolation? A sound started then, so low and deep it was felt more than heard. A vibration that came up through the soles of his feet, a resonant hum that made his teeth ache. It was the house, the very frame of it, groaning like the hull of a great ship. The damp patch on the wall began to weep, a thin, oily fluid that traced a glistening path down to the floorboards. His mother let out a small, choked sound. Dalton turned. She was staring at the wall opposite the sofa. The floral wallpaper was changing. The faded roses were darkening, their petals deepening to a livid red. The green vines connecting them thickened, becoming more defined, more real. As he watched, a new pattern emerged between the flowers, a pattern of tiny, screaming faces woven into the background. It was the same pattern from the fabric. From the night everything began. His father saw it too. He did not react. He simply closed his eyes, as if he could no longer bear to look. The front door creaked. Not a sound of someone trying to open it, but the sound of the door itself, the wood and hinges, shifting of their own accord. The brass doorknob turned, slowly, deliberately. There was no one on the other side. The door swung inward, revealing the wall of fog. And then the guests began to arrive. They did not walk out of the fog. They condensed from it, their forms coalescing from the swirling gray. They were tall, slender, and indistinct, their features smoothed away as if by wind and water. They moved with a silent, gliding motion, passing over the threshold without a sound. They brought the cold of the fog with them, and a smell of turned earth and frost. They filled the living room, these silent, faceless figures, standing in a loose circle around Dalton S. family. They did not speak. They did not move. They simply were, their presence a suffocating weight. Dalton felt a profound wrongness, not of malice, but of utter indifference. They were not here for vengeance. They were here for consumption. Harlow stood up. She walked to the center of the room, to the space between the sofa and the faceless guests. She looked at Dalton, and for the second time that day, he saw a flicker in her eyes. It was not terror this time. It was an apology. Then she opened her mouth, and the chorus of the house poured out. The creaks and the groans and the whispers from the walls. forming a single, clear sentence. The story is ready to be told. One of the tall figures glided forward. It raised a long, pale hand, not to touch Harlow, but to hover just above her head. From her, a fine, silver mist began to drift upward, like breath on a cold day. It was not her breath, it was her. The mist swirled, and within it, Dalton saw images. A little girl on a swing. A birthday cake with bright pink frosting. Harlow, his Harlow, laughing. The figure drew the mist into itself, and the images vanished. Then it was his mother's turn. The figure moved to her, and the same silver stream, filled with memories of lullabies and warm kitchens and a wedding day, was drawn out and consumed. His father was next, his quiet strength, his love for his family, all siphoned away into the waiting silence. Dalton backed into a corner, his heart a frantic bird beating against his ribs. He was last. The figure turned its smooth, blank face toward him. He could feel it, a pulling sensation at the very core of his being, a thread being tugged, ready to unravel his entire life. He squeezed his eyes shut, thinking of his notebook, of the maps, of the stories. It was all he had left. The pulling stopped. He opened his eyes. The figure was still there, its hand still raised, but it was tilted, as if confused. From the kitchen, the dripping faucet gave one final, loud plink and fell silent. The figure lowered its hand. It turned its head, looking toward the back of the house, toward the yard where the pumpkin sat. It glided away, the other forms parting for it. They all turned, and as silently as they had arrived, flowed back out the front door and dissolved into the fog. The door swung shut. The latch clicked. Dalton stood trembling in the corner. His family remained on the sofa, their bodies present, their eyes open, but they were empty, hollowed out. The house was quiet. The violent energy was gone, replaced by a deep, satiated stillness. He was alone. They had left him behind. He was not a nutrient. He was the sole, surviving seed, left in the barren soil to see what would grow. He did not know how long he stood there, staring at the empty shells of his parents. Their chests still rose and fell with a mechanical rhythm, but the people who had inhabited them were gone. The house around him felt different. The oppressive hunger had vanished, replaced by a heavy, drowsy fullness. The walls seemed to sigh, the floorboards to settle just a little deeper into the earth. It was over. The feast was complete. He walked past the sofa, his footsteps echoing in the new silence. He did not look at their faces. He went to the back door and looked out. The fog was lifting, not burning away in sunlight, but simply receding, pulling back like a tide to reveal a gray, washed-out world. The yard was a wasteland of churned, black soil. The massive pumpkin vine was gone, withered to a brittle black thread. Of the great pumpkin itself, there was no sign, only a shallow, scorched depression in the earth where it had rested. He turned back to the kitchen. The faucet was dry. The hum of the refrigerator was absent. He opened it. The light inside was dead. The food within was desiccated, covered in a fine, gray mold. Everything was used up. A small, dry sound made him turn. Harlow was standing in the doorway to the living room. She blinked slowly. Her expression was vacant, a clean slate. She looked at him without recognition. Then her gaze drifted to the empty kitchen. She walked to the table, pulled out a chair, and sat down, folding her hands in her lap. She was waiting for instructions that would never come. Dalton climbed the stairs. The damp patch on the wall was dry, a brittle, flaking stain. In his room, he knelt and pulled the notebook from under his mattress. He opened it to the last page, to the map of their siege. He took a pencil from his desk. His hand did not shake. He drew the final landmark. He drew the scorched circle in the backyard. He drew the faceless guests in the living room. He drew the hollow people on the sofa. He did not write any words. There were no words left. He closed the notebook and held it in his hands. It was not a record of a haunting. It was a deed. It was the title to this new, silent world. He was the curator of the empty museum, the keeper of the quiet. He walked to the window and looked out at the gray street. A car drove by, its engine a distant, foreign sound. Life was going on out there, but it was behind a pane of glass he could no longer open. Downstairs, his father stood up from the sofa and walked into the kitchen. He opened a cabinet, stared at its empty shelves for a moment, and then closed it again. He did not look at Dalton when he came back down. He did not look at anyone. He simply resumed his seat. Dalton placed the notebook on his desk. He would not hide it anymore. There was no one to hide it from. He sat on the edge of his bed and listened to the new sound of his house. It was the sound of dust settling. It was the sound of a story that had been told in full, leaving only the blank, white space after the final period. He was that space, and he knew, with a cold and certain clarity, that his only job now was to wait. The house was full, but it was not dead. It was only sleeping, and eventually it would get hungry again. The days began to blend, one into the next, marked only by the slow parade of shadows across the floor. Dalton fell into the rituals of maintenance. He tried the taps every morning, but only dust puffed from the spout. He checked the pantry, but the cans were now just hollow metallic shells that crumpled at a touch. His family moved through the rooms with a listless, automated grace. They did not speak. They did not eat. They were like wind-up toys, slowly winding down. He found himself talking to them sometimes, his voice a hoarse, unfamiliar rustle in the stillness. "I'm going to sweep the porch," he would say, "or the sky looks clear today." They never responded. Their eyes were cameras with the lenses capped, recording nothing. One afternoon, he noticed a change in Harlow. She had resumed her place on the living room floor, but she was not drawing. She was sorting. She had a small pile of dust and dead insects she had gathered from a windowsill, and she was meticulously arranging them into a spiral pattern. Her movements were precise, intentional. It was the first purposeful thing he had seen any of them do since the harvest. A cold knot tightened in his stomach. This was not his sister returning. This was something else. This was the house, beginning to stir again, using her hands as its tools. That night, he was woken by a sound. It was a soft, scraping noise coming from the walls. Not the aggressive scratching of before, but a patient, persistent sound, like someone sanding wood. He got out of bed and pressed his ear to the plaster. The vibration traveled through his skull. It was the sound of something being shaped, of something being prepared. He went to his desk and opened the notebook. In the moonlight, he saw that the drawing of the scorched circle in the backyard was no longer empty. Without him drawing it, a faint green shoot had appeared on the page, emerging from the center of the depression. He slammed the book shut, his heart hammering. It was starting. The house was not just hungry. It was planting. The next morning, he went outside. The air was crisp and still. And there, in the exact center of the blackened earth, was a single green sprout. It was no bigger than his thumbnail, but it was a violent, vibrant green, a color that did not belong in the washed-out world. He knew he should tear it out, stamp it into the dirt. But he couldn't. His hand wouldn't move. It was part of the story now, and his role was to observe, to record, to wait. He went back inside. His mother was in the kitchen. She was standing at the counter, her hands moving in a pantomime of kneading dough. There was nothing there. Her face was a mask of serene concentration. She was practicing. He understood then. They weren't just hollow. They were vessels, being cleaned and prepared for the next offering. He climbed the stairs and looked out his window at the tiny green shoot. It was so small, so fragile, but he knew what it would become. He was the keeper of the quiet, the guardian of the soil. He was the one who would make sure the story had someone left to tell it when the guests returned. He turned from the window and went to his desk. He opened the notebook to a fresh page. He picked up his pencil, and he began to draw. The pencil moved almost on its own, its scratch the only sound in the room. He drew the sprout, exaggerating its size, giving its two tiny leaves a cruel, hooked shape. He drew his mother at her invisible dough, her hands blurred with motion. He drew Harlow's spiral of dust, and as he put the final line on the paper, he heard a soft crumble from downstairs. He knew, without looking, that the pattern had collapsed. Days turned into a week. The sprout grew with an unnatural speed, its stem thickening, its leaves unfurling into broad, waxy shields. It was another pumpkin vine. This one did not spread wildly. It grew straight up, a thick, hairy stalk that leaned against the back of the house, its tip questing just beneath his parents' bedroom window. His father began a new ritual. Every evening, as the light failed, he would go into the garage and return with a rusty watering can. He would walk to the sink, hold the can under the dry faucet, and stand there for exactly 1 minute, listening to the silence. Then he would go outside and tip the empty can over the base of the vine. The pantomime was as precise as his mother's baking. The house was teaching them their roles. Dalton kept drawing. He filled pages with the vine's progress, with the vacant stares of his family, with the way the shadows in the hall seemed to congeal into familiar, slender shapes as dusk fell. The notebook was no longer a record. It was a script. He was transcribing the house's intentions. One night, a faint, melodic hum woke him. It was coming from Harlow-'s room. He crept to her door and pushed it open. She was sitting on her bed, facing the wall, rocking gently back and forth. The sound was not the house's chorus. It was a simple, tuneless little song, one she used to sing to her dolls. A relic, a piece of debris that had been missed in the harvesting. As he listened, the humming faltered. She forgot the tune. She started again from the beginning, but it was weaker this time, the notes crumbling into silence. She stopped rocking. She sat perfectly still for a moment, then she lay down and went to sleep. The house had found the loose thread and snipped it. The next morning, he saw the first bud. It was a hard, green fist of a thing, clinging to the vine where it pressed against the house. It was directly beneath his parents' window. He went to his notebook and drew it. He shaded it darkly, making it look heavy, pregnant, with potential. He knew what kind of fruit grew from memories. He knew which room S memories were being tapped. He looked up from his drawing and saw his mother standing in his doorway. She was holding a plate. On it was a pile of dust and shredded paper arranged to look like a meal. Her eyes were not on him, but on the notebook. Her head tilted. For a single, terrifying second, he thought she saw it, that she understood. Then her gaze went through him, and she turned and walked away, offering the empty plate to the empty hallway. Dalton closed the book. The vine was growing. The vessels were being prepared. The story was beginning its second chapter, and he was the only one who could read the words. He was not a character. He was the scribe. And he knew that when the new pumpkin was ripe and the guests returned, his family would not be the only offering. The house would need a new story to tell. It would need his memories, his fears, his own quiet life. It would need the scribe himself. He picked up his pencil. There was still so much to document before the end.